If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 116, Name Your Terms. Hermes nodded and didn't press further. He could tell Regulus didn't want to elaborate, and he could guess that certain threads ran too deep. As for how Regulus knew what he knew, that part didn't puzzle him at all. Silence held for a few more seconds. Cuthbert glanced between Hermes and Regulus, fingers tapping the armrest of his chair. Alex still stood by the window, angled sideways, gaze resting on the center of the room. Regulus could feel the change in Hermes. Before, there'd always been something sullen about him. A loner by habit, carrying a quiet contempt for everything around him. That contempt had faded, replaced by something more layered. Gratitude, wariness, and something else beneath both. But Hermes was still Hermes. A mole cyberborn wizard raised on dark arts since childhood, with an attachment to power that ran bone deep. His pride was different from Cuthbert's. Cuthbert's pride lived in bloodline and status, in the weight the name Avery carried in pure blood circles. Hermes took pride in what he could do. In the dark spells that could maim and kill. In the parts of his family's legacy that most wizards feared. Regulus had a fair idea what was running through his head. Hermes believed he wielded real power. Believed that in an unrestrained fight to the death, armed with those dark arts, he might not lose. A Brosmole cyber had probably told his son to follow Regulus Black at school. But left it to Hermes to verify whether Regulus was worth following. So when Hermes raised his head, locked eyes with Regulus, and said what he said, none of it came as a surprise. "I want to fight you again." Cuthbert sat bolt upright, eyes bright, the corner of his mouth splitting into an eager grin. Alex turned from the window, brow creasing. His lips moved as if to speak, but nothing came out. He looked to Regulus instead. Regulus studied Hermes. Pale face, steady eyes. His fingers trembled slightly at his side, and Regulus could tell it wasn't fear. Hermes was running hot. Wizards had adrenaline too. "Why?" Regulus asked, tone flat. "Do I need a reason?" Hermes shot back, an edge of cold iron in his voice. "I want to know how strong you are. Last term didn't count. I wasn't ready, and you weren't trying." Regulus heard what he was really saying. Hermes needed a total defeat, or an unexpected victory, to settle where he stood. He wasn't fully convinced yet. Still thought he had cards left to play. Still thought he had a chance. "Fine." Regulus nodded. Cuthbert nearly launched out of his chair. Alex muttered something under his breath, but no one paid attention. "Not here," Regulus added. "No room to work." He turned toward the door, hand on the handle, and glanced back. Hermes was already on his feet. Cuthbert fell in close behind. Alex hesitated a beat, then followed. The four of them left the Slytherin common room and headed up through the underground corridor. A few upperclassmen passed them on the way. The formation drew curious looks, but nobody asked. Regulus walked at the front. He'd agreed for one reason only. Hermes needed to be broken. Words wouldn't do it. Shared interests weren't enough. He had to feel the gap firsthand. Feel that helplessness. The despair of not even being able to see how far behind he was. Only then would Hermes set his pride aside and give real thought to what following meant. 8th floor. Across from the tapestry. Regulus paced the corridor 3 times, thinking, "I need a dueling space. Large enough for a real fight." A wooden door materialized. He pushed it open. Inside lay a standard dueling arena. Cuthbert stepped in first, his footsteps thudding dully against the wooden floor. He looked around, eyes wide. The room of requirement, it's real. Alex followed, testing the floor with careful steps, as if checking whether it was solid. He looked up at the ceiling, then the walls, lips parting slightly. Hermes entered last. The room itself didn't interest him. One quick sweep of the layout, open space, no obstacles, good for movement and spell work. All his attention was on Regulus. His wand had risen halfway before he forced it back down. "Rules?" Hermes asked. His voice carried a faint echo in the cavernous space. "Your call." Regulus walked to the center of the arena and turned to face him. Cuthbert and Alex retreated to the wall without being told, pressing themselves into the corner. Alex stood a bit farther back, body tense, eyes flicking between the two. Hermes stopped 10 meters out. He drew a deep breath, chest rising and falling, and his wand hand steadied. I want to know the real gap, he said, voice firm. So. The sentence died unfinished. Regulus raised his right hand. A small curl of the fingers, nothing more. The air shimmered with faint ripples. A sting bit into Hermes's throat. A stone spike had appeared from nowhere, its tip resting half a centimeter below his Adam's apple. Not deep. Just enough to break skin, drawing a single bead of blood. It hung there, perfectly still, as though it had always belonged in that exact spot. Hermes froze. He hadn't seen the spike form. No flash of spell work. No casting tell of any kind. 1 second the air was empty. The next, something that could kill him occupied it. Alex sucked in a breath. Cuthbert's eyes went wide, body leaning forward, trying to catch every detail. Regulus hadn't moved. Hadn't even drawn his wand. He watched Hermes with an expression so calm he might have been brushing dust off his sleeve. Hermes's throat bobbed. The swallow pushed the spike's tip another half millimeter into his skin. Warm blood crept down his neck, soaking into his collar. He eased backward, steps feather-light, cautious. The spike didn't follow. It stayed fixed in place, tip still wet with his blood. 2 meters back, Hermes finally dared to touch his neck. His fingers found the wound, and the slick warmth made his heart slam. Now he could see it clearly. About 15 centimeters long, roughly 1 thick, surface rough, tip razor sharp. It hung in the air without bobbing or drifting, pinned there by some invisible nail. He'd barely begun to exhale when the spike started spinning. Slowly at first, each rotation still trackable by eye. Then faster. And faster. A blurred grey smear. The surface began to glow red. Friction against the air at that speed generated heat, enough to make stone radiate light. Cuthbert's mouth hung open, breathing forgotten. Alex retreated half a step, back flat against the wall. Hermes watched the glowing, screaming, spinning spike. His mind flashed to last term in the dormitory. Regulus making the air stop working. The suffocation. Collapsing to the floor. He'd asked his father about it afterward. Ambrose had called it an advanced application of Transfiguration. He hadn't believed it at the time. But when he'd felt that suffocation a second time, he'd believed. So what was this? Transfiguration again? Transfigured from what? His peripheral vision swept the arena. Empty. The floor didn't even have dust on it. Regulus obviously hadn't meant to kill him. If he had, the spike would have punched through his throat the instant it appeared. Or now, spinning fast enough to heat stone to a glow, a casual flick would cave his skull in. This was a demonstration. I can end you whenever I want. No wand. No incantation. Without even letting you see how it's done. The spike stopped. The transition from screaming velocity to dead stillness was so abrupt it defied physics. 1 second, shrieking and glowing. The next, frozen in the air without a trace of inertia. The red light drained away. Stone cooled. Gray-white color returned. Then the spike dissolved. The arena fell quiet again. Hermes still stood in place. The blood on his neck had stopped flowing. Only the sting of the wound reminded him any of it had happened. His throat was dry. He wanted to speak but couldn't find his voice. Regulus watched him, waited a few seconds, and spoke again. Now. How do you want to do this? Hermes took 10 seconds to steady his breathing. He reached up and wiped the blood from his neck. His fingers paused over the wound. Barely a scratch. Didn't even need a healing charm. Everything he'd walked in expecting had shattered in a single moment. Chapter 117, From Brawl to Duel. Hermes had expected something closer to an even fight. Or at least a fight where he could measure the gap. Wand against wand. Spell against spell. Dark arts against dark arts. He'd prepared several tactics, multiple contingency plans, even rehearsed how to concede gracefully if things went south. But Regulus had used a single stone spike to tell him none of that applied. In a real fight, he wouldn't get to cast at all. The emotions churning through him were tangled. Part of it was bitterness. Years of practicing dark arts, mastering spell after harmful spell, and he couldn't even get one off before it was over. Part of it was acceptance. A gap that wide left no room for argument. And part of it was excitement. Seeing power at that level, magic applied in ways that exceeded anything he'd imagined, had lit the hunger that lived in his bones. He wanted to know how strong Regulus truly was. Wanted to know how long it would take to close the distance, even if all he could manage was a glimpse of the silhouette ahead. So he swallowed everything down, lifted his chin, and spoke in a voice he fought to keep steady. Like a proper wizard's duel. Cuthbert laughed from the sidelines. Alex tried to hold it in and failed, the corner of his mouth curling upward. Hermes ignored them both. His eyes stayed locked on Regulus. Formal. We bow, then we start. Regulus saw no reason to refuse. Fine. They walked to the center of the arena and stopped 5 meters apart. Hermes bowed first. Textbook form. Back straight, head lowered, arms hanging naturally at his sides. Regulus returned it. Smaller in scope, but flawless in execution, the unconscious elegance drilled into pure-blood children from birth. Wasted on a blind audience. As Hermes rose, his wand was already at chest height, tip angled slightly downward in the standard opening stance. He didn't attack right away. He did something else first. Bubblehead charm. A transparent bubble bloomed from his wand tip, expanding quickly to encase his head. It clung close to the skin, leaving his vision and breathing unaffected while sealing out the surrounding air. He remembered the suffocation in the dormitory last term. Whatever method Regulus had used to neutralize the air, the bubblehead charm would at least keep his lungs working. Transfiguration wouldn't get him this time. He'd trained specifically for this. Regulus eyed the bubble. He almost smiled but didn't. His right hand held his wand, hanging loose at his side. His left rose, palm up, in a casual after-you gesture. Cuthbert cleared his throat from the wall. Ready, begin. The instant the word left his mouth, Hermes sidestepped left, wand slashing out. Impedimenta. The jinx streaked toward Regulus's chest. Not meant to land. Meant to force movement or a defensive response. Regulus did neither. His wand arm stayed down. A meter from his body, the spell struck something invisible. It cracked apart with a sharp pop, dissolving into fine sparks. Hermes frowned. He kept moving, circling toward Regulus's flank, wand snapping through rapid arcs. Locomotor mortis. Petrificus totalis. Rictus empra. 3 spells from 3 different angles, each a different color, all fast. Same result. Each one shattered against the unseen barrier a meter out. Burst and scattered. Regulus didn't even turn. When Hermes circled behind him, he remained facing forward, head slightly bowed, gaze on the floor. The barrier covered every angle. Front, back, sides, above, below. A full sphere with no blind spots. Hermes stopped, breathing hard from nerves and adrenaline. The bubble over his head swelled and contracted with each breath. Basic spells were useless. He'd expected that. Time for something heavier. A deep breath. Wand raised high. He began chanting a long incantation, syllables guttural and strange. This was his strongest suit. Bone and blood stripping. More refined and more vicious than the version he'd used during the chief competition. Faster, more powerful. He'd drilled this one on purpose. A beam of light shot toward Regulus, dark red bleeding into black, radiating cold and suffering. This time the barrier didn't fully materialize. Only a sliver of silver light appeared where beam met shield. And the erosion was slower. Hermes gritted his teeth and pushed more power into it. The beam thickened, its color deepening to near total black. The spell's structure destabilized. Jagged arcs of energy spat outward like lightning, striking the floor with a hiss, leaving scorched, corroded marks on the wood. The barrier began to show itself, though still not completely. Behind Regulus, a partial wall of silver materialized, dense and crystalline. Regulus finally moved. He turned his head to study the point of contact. Then he nodded, satisfied. Hermes had improved. He raised his left hand, index finger extended, and tapped the barrier once. It flared brilliant white and surged outward, magic erupting from inside, sending a shockwave radiating out from Regulus in every direction. A sharp, bell-clear ring of metal on metal split the air. The black beam shattered into scattering light. The shockwave kept going and slammed into Hermes. He staggered back 3 steps. The bubblehead charm wobbled violently, nearly popping. He planted his feet, chest tight, organs rattled by the impact. Regulus looked at him, voice level. Keep going. Hermes swallowed. He could feel the drain. That dark arts had cost enormous power, and it hadn't even cracked the barrier. And Regulus hadn't raised his wand. Looked like he was enjoying a walk. But there was still one more card. A nastier one. His right hand tightened on the wand and thrust it forward. His left hand braced beside it. A new incantation began. Longer this time. Harder to pronounce. Every syllable carried a dark, viscous weight. The temperature in the arena dropped. Light dimmed. Against the wall, Cuthbert and Alex hugged their arms without realizing it. Shadow bind devour. A pool of thick shadow spread across the floor. Black, writhing and alive. Its center bulged upward. Tentacle-like bands of darkness rose into the air, twisting, seeking a target. Summoning class dark magic. A magical imprint extracted from a creature of darkness, capable of manifesting shadow tentacles that mimicked the original's attack patterns. The tentacles were solid. They could bind an enemy and continuously drain both life force and magical energy. Anyone caught would feel bone-deep cold and a hollowing weakness that reached the soul. At full extension, the tentacles stood nearly 2 meters tall. 7 or 8 bands of varying thickness whipped through the air, their tips sharp as spearheads. Hermes's face had gone white. Maintaining this spell bled magic like an open vein. But he held on, teeth clenched, wand towards Regulus, eyes fierce. All 7 or 8 tendrils lashed out simultaneously, streaking through the air in blurred dark lines, stabbing toward Regulus from every direction. Then they stopped. Every tentacle froze a meter from him. They thrashed and stabbed, straining forward, but couldn't gain a centimeter. Where shadow met barrier, sounds sputtered and cracked. Nothing more. Hermes's eyes went wide. The barrier surfaced again, brighter this time. Then it snapped outward in reverse, spreading like a vast net that engulfed the tentacles and began contracting. The tendrils compressed, warped, and shrieked with a sound like twisting metal. Cracks splintered across their surfaces, spreading, widening, until each tentacle burst into black shards that hit the floor and dissolved into dark smoke. 1, 2, 3, all of them crushed within 2 seconds. Light returned to the arena. Warmth crept back. Hermes's leg buckled. He dropped to one knee, wand bracing against the floor to keep from collapsing entirely. He gasped for air, the bubble heaving with each breath, sweat rolling from his forehead and dripping onto the wood. His reserves were nearly spent. 2 major dark spells plus the earlier probing jinxes had drained him to the dregs. Regulus watched him and waited a moment before speaking. That's enough. Hermes raised his head. Any more dark arts and something might go wrong. His tone was calm, giving Hermes one last shred of dignity. He raised his wand for the first time. I'll use one spell. Try to block it. Hermes sucked in a deep breath and forced himself upright. A flick of his wand dismissed the bubblehead charm. The bubble dissolved. It was useless against Regulus anyway. Then he began the incantation for Protego. The shield took shape, a pale blue, translucent barrier unfolding before him, irregular in form. For a first year, producing a formed Protego at all was a mark of genuine talent, even an imperfect one. Regulus studied the shield. His left index finger tapped once. Knockback jinx. A bolt of red light shot out and struck Hermes's Protego. The shield broke. It exploded into countless pale blue fragments that glittered once in the air and vanished. Chapter 118, Utterly Convinced Bonus. Hermes stood frozen. He recognized the knockback jinx well enough, but he'd never imagined it could shatter a Protego. Under normal circumstances, the jinx would bounce off a shield charm or cancel out against it. Regulus's version carried so much raw force that the barrier's structure simply couldn't hold. In the half-second he spent processing that, Regulus's wand finally moved. Incendio. A ball of flame hurtled toward him. Hermes had no time to cast a second Protego. He didn't have the power for one anyway. He tried to dodge and couldn't. He threw both arms over his head, squeezed his eyes shut, and braced for the end. But the fire reached him and bloomed outward instead of striking, wrapping around his body like a shell. Then it flashed. Blinding white light erupted across the arena. Cuthbert and Alex turned away simultaneously, eyes clenched shut. A wave of heat rolled over them, fierce but brief. A tenth of a second, maybe less. The light died. Hermes was still standing. Unburned, unhurt. His hair, however, was a different story. What had been straight black locks was now a wild puff of tight curls. He reached up and touched his hair. His fingers met the curled ends and stopped. He lowered his hand. The arena went quiet for a few seconds. Cuthbert broke first. He doubled over, howling, arms clutching his sides. Alex followed, though quieter, hand clamped over his mouth. Joy and suffering don't always travel the same road. Hermes wasn't laughing. He stood there looking at Regulus for a long time. Then he walked over to where Cuthbert and Alex were standing by the wall. Turned around. Faced Regulus in the center of the arena. He was done fighting it. Beaten, convinced, and from here on out, committed. Regulus stowed his wand and walked over to them. That's enough for today. His tone hadn't shifted, flat and unhurried, as if nothing had happened. Go eat. There are afternoon classes. The four of them left the room of requirement. The door sealed behind them, and the corridor stretched empty in both directions. It was already lunchtime. On the way to the Great Hall, Cuthbert was still buzzing, replaying every detail at full volume. Did you see that stone spike? The thing was glowing red. And the incendio? I thought he was going to set Hermes on fire for real. Alex murmured agreement here and there, but his eyes kept drifting to Hermes. Hermes walked in silence, hand rising occasionally to touch the ruined curls, his face blank. But Regulus could feel it. That stubborn thorn of defiance that had lodged itself under Hermes's skin was gone. Exactly as he'd predicted from the start. A raw display of power, an overwhelming gap made visible. The simplest method was the most effective. Not that fighting Hermes qualified as a warm-up. Regulus felt nothing particular about it. He understood the distance between them with clinical clarity. It went beyond technique or knowledge. It was a fundamental difference in the tier of power they operated on. When two wizards existed on different levels entirely, combat could be elegant, leisurely, almost ceremonial in its grace. Like an adult facing a child. No need for full effort, no need for tricks. Standing still was enough. It had been the same in Nocturne Alley against those four dark wizards. He'd stood in place, cast, and they'd dropped. The duel with his father, Orion, had been different. That fight had required real movement, anticipation, tactics. Wide shifts in stance, precision in every spell, airtight defense, decisive counters. Because Orion operated on a higher tier. The gap just wasn't insurmountable. A thought drifted through Regulus's mind. At my current level, when someone truly powerful fights me, Dumbledore, Voldemort, is it as effortless for them as it was for me against Hermes? The thought completed its circuit and he let it go. No point dwelling on it. The answer was obviously yes. Late March brought warmer weather to Hogwarts. Most of the snow around the castle had melted. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall's lesson for the day was advanced inanimate to animate transformation, turning a carved wooden bird into a real one, capable of flight and song. The key lies in understanding the boundary between life and non-life. She stood at the front of the classroom, wand moving in a light, precise arc. The carved wooden nightingale on her desk began to tremble. Feathers sprouted from the grain of the wood. Its eyes shifted from dull paint to bright, living alertness. Transfiguration cannot create life. It grants a form of functional vitality. Be clear on this, that a transfigured creature possesses no true soul. Its behavior is driven entirely by the magic sustaining it. She completed the spell and the nightingale lifted off the desk, circled the room once, then landed on the windowsill and began to sing. The song was clear and sharp, its wing beats strong. But careful observation revealed patterns. Every third lap it made the same turn. Every fifth call was followed by a distinct pause. Now, begin. McGonagall surveyed the room. One carving each. Finish before class ends. Remember, the goal is the feeling of life, not merely the appearance. Regulus received a carved wooden owl. He raised his wand and tapped it once. The surface began to shift. A warm sheen spread across the wood as the grain stretched outward, splitting into fine, layered feather patterns. The body swelled slightly. Wings unfolded from either side. Talons separated from the base. 2 points of amber light kindled where the eyes had been. The head swiveled. A soft, low hoot. When it was done, the wooden owl had become a living one. Or close enough that no one could tell the difference. It stood on the desk, tilting its head at Regulus. Its wingspan stretched half a meter, feathers layered in sharp detail. McGonagall walked over and inspected it closely. She reached out and brushed a wing. The feathers were soft, springy under her fingers. She prompted it to fly. It circled the classroom twice, landed on Regulus's shoulder, and began preening with its beak. Perfect. She nodded, expression stern, though approval flickered in her eyes. Complete form, strong vitality, natural movement. 10 points to Slytherin. Thank you, Professor, Regulus said with a polite nod. McGonagall returned it, then turned and moved on to check the others. The Slytherin and Ravenclaw first years around him had long since stopped being surprised by this sort of thing. A few glanced at the owl with idle curiosity, then went back to wrestling with their own transfigurations. Regulus raised his arm, and the owl glided down to perch on it. He could feel the rhythm of magic cycling through its body, a stable, looping structure of power that maintained the transfiguration's effect. When the bell rang, most students had managed the basics. Their carvings could move and call, but the details were rough, the movements jerky, the sounds like wood scraping against wood. Only a handful had produced anything convincing. Regulus's was flawless. Students packed up and filed out. Cuthbert, Alex, and Hermes looked toward Regulus. He hadn't moved from his seat, still watching the owl. The three exchanged a glance, said nothing, picked up their bags, and left. They knew the pattern by now. If he stayed behind after class, he had questions for the professor. Early on, they'd waited. Then they noticed his conversations with the professors kept running longer and longer, and they stopped. The classroom emptied quickly. McGonagall tidied her desk, looked up, and saw Regulus still there. One eyebrow rose slightly. "Mr. Black, come to my office." He stood. The owl settled on his shoulder. He followed her out of the classroom, down the corridor, and into the Transfiguration professor's office. McGonagall settled into the chair behind her desk and gestured him to the one opposite. "You've absorbed the notes?" she asked, hands folded on the desk. "Memorized them," Regulus said. "Still practicing." He drew two objects from his pocket, a diamond, clear and brilliant, and a lump of dark grey graphite. His wand rose and tapped the diamond. It began to change. The transparent crystalline structure contracted inward as molecules rearranged themselves. Color shifted from clear to dark grey, hardness gave way to softness, and a layered texture appeared across the surface. Diamond became graphite. Another tap. The process reversed. The layered structure collapsed as molecules rebuilt into a three-dimensional lattice. Grey darkened back to transparency. Soft became hard. Graphite became diamond. The entire sequence was smooth, controlled. No stray magic leaked from the transformation, no flicker of structural instability, no failed halfway state. Diamond and graphite shifted back and forth. McGonagall watched, and the approval in her gaze deepened noticeably. She could tell he hadn't just memorized the notes. He'd put in serious hours of practice. Chapter 119, McGonagall is a good professor. Good. McGonagall leaned forward, resting against the edge of her desk. You've clearly been practicing, and thinking for yourself. What's on your mind today? Regulus lowered his wand. The diamond and graphite stopped shifting and settled back to their original states. He took a few seconds to organize his thoughts. Professor, can transfiguration only be applied to physical objects? McGonagall's eyebrow rose. Meaning? Natural phenomena, for instance. He set the words out carefully. A bolt of lightning. A flame. A gust of wind. Can those serve as targets for transfiguration? Or magic itself? A spell already in flight. Could it be transfigured mid-air? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Her fingers tapped the desk twice. Yes, she said, voice certain. But it isn't easy. Regulus heard the subtext. Beyond most wizards. But well within her reach. That much was obvious. She was a transfiguration master. He'd asked the question to open the door, not because he doubted the answer. The core of transfiguration is change. McGonagall continued, her voice level and clear. No hesitation, as though the answer had been waiting, fully formed, for him to ask. Changing an object's form, its properties, its function. In theory, anything that exists, including magical constructs, can be changed. The difficulty varies. She pulled a sheet of parchment from a drawer, dipped a quill in ink, and began writing. Transfiguring a concrete object, say, turning a desk into a pig, requires understanding the material structure of the desk and the biological structure of the pig. Transfiguring a natural phenomenon, turning flame into water, requires understanding the energy structure of fire and the material structure of water, plus managing the conversion between energy and matter. Transfiguring a spell itself, turning a stunner into a Wingardium Leviosa. Her quill traced a complex symbol on the parchment. That requires understanding the magical structure of the spell, grasping the fundamental difference between two distinct spells, and completing both analysis and reconstruction in an extremely short window. The number of people in magical Britain who can do that is small. Even framed that way, Regulus could hear what she wasn't saying. She was one of them. He studied the symbol. It was the ancient rune's word for change, its strokes twisted, carrying a sense of motion even on static parchment. You're asking because you've been thinking about combat applications. McGonagall set down her quill and looked up at him, cutting straight to the point. Partly. Regulus conceded it with a respectful nod. I've been wondering whether, in a fight, I could transfigure an incoming spell directly. Turn an attack into harmless light, or reshape it into a shield. Theoretically possible, McGonagall said. Practically, nearly impossible. Spells travel too fast. The reaction window is too narrow. Unless you can predict the trajectory, or... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Unless the power gap was overwhelming, or the caster had a particular gift. He could already intercept spells with spells, and since gaining spatial awareness, he could detect a curse's trajectory earlier than most. That was a form of prediction, in its own right. He could even calculate flight paths in his head. But against a skilled opponent, none of that would hold. Even if he could pull it off, the cost-benefit ratio was terrible. One miscalculation and he'd be on the back foot. That same effort spent dodging or shielding would serve him better. Transfiguration does have other combat applications, however. McGonagall shifted direction. Altering the environment. Turning the ground to swamp, walls to spikes, air to solid mass. Or targeting the opponent's equipment. Wand to twig. Ropes to rope. Spectacles to barbed wire. As she spoke, her wand flicked. A quill on the desk began to change. The shaft elongated, split, sprouted leaves, and became a small branch. The branch contracted, thinned, and became a length of fine cord. The cord shifted again, reshaping into a tiny pair of round-framed spectacles. These applications don't require split-second execution. They can be prepared in advance, or you can create openings for them mid-fight, she continued. The prerequisite is deep enough mastery that you can maintain precision under pressure. Regulus nodded. These tactics aligned with his own thinking. Use transfiguration to reshape the battlefield and force the opponent into a rhythm you'd already planned for. But he also knew this was foundational, far from advanced. Anyone with a decent grasp of basic transfiguration and a flexible mind could arrive at the same conclusions. His real question lay elsewhere. Everything McGonagall had said and demonstrated today had already gone well beyond the normal scope of instruction. Combat applications of transfiguration, even directional guidance, had no place in a first-year curriculum. A professor known for rigor and proper foundations would not normally share this kind of practical combat knowledge with young students, especially not first years. Yet she had not just explained it, but demonstrated, and broken down the theory. Regulus thought of Professor Sprout. The Hufflepuff head of house had done the same. When he'd asked about opposing magical plant properties, she'd shown him the sunlight ebony bush directly, explained concepts reserved for N.E.W.T.S level study. He'd initiated every one of those conversations. But the professors hadn't dismissed him for being a first year. Hadn't deflected because he was a Slytherin, or because his name was Black. A figure flashed through his mind. Dumbledore. Those blue eyes behind half-moon spectacles, warm yet carrying something deeper. Expectation that stretched far ahead. Regulus set the thought aside. If the professors were willing to teach, was he going to be afraid to learn? And as for the future? Every worry traced back to the same root, not enough power. He looked up at McGonagall. The question turned over in his mouth once before he chose the most direct version. Professor, can space itself be transfigured? He stayed quiet after that, waiting. What followed was half a minute of silence. McGonagall sat behind her desk, leaning slightly forward, hands folded on the surface, eyes lowered behind her spectacles, fixed on some point on the table. The air in the office seemed to thicken. The crackle of the hearth became unnervingly loud. On the wall, the painting of the cat chasing a butterfly had gone still. Regulus could feel her thinking. Deciding how to answer, whether to answer, how much to give. He was on the verge of a polite goodbye when McGonagall stood, crossed to the open space in the center of the office, and raised her wand. A turn of her wrist. Nothing more. The office began to change. All four walls started moving. Space itself stretched. The front and back walls receded into the distance while the side walls pressed inward. The room shifted from a square to a long corridor. The ceiling climbed. The floor sank. Then space flipped. Regulus's sense of direction scrambled. Gravity seemed to shift. The hem of his robes and strands of his hair drifted upward, though they were actually falling down. Books stayed on their shelves. The fire still burned upward in the hearth. But the picture frames on the wall had tilted 30 degrees. Last came distortion. Space warped like dough kneaded by invisible hands. Portions bulged outward while others collapsed inward. The area near the door compressed. The area near the window expanded. Light bent along the twisted geometry, casting strange shadows on the walls, shapes that shifted and reformed without end. 10 seconds, start to finish. Then McGonagall swept her wand again, and everything snapped back. Walls returned to their positions. Ceiling and floor resumed their proper height. Direction righted itself. Light fell in straight lines. The office looked exactly as it had before, as though nothing had happened. But Regulus knew what he'd seen. McGonagall had used Transfiguration to alter the structure of space directly. Not the way an extension charm expanded an interior. This was genuine transformation of space's own shape. He sat in the chair, mind racing through analysis. Transfiguration could alter matter. It could alter energy. And now, it could alter space. The implications were enormous. It meant Transfiguration's scope was far broader than he'd imagined. Its ceiling, far higher. He recalled what McGonagall had told him once: Transfiguration is one of magic's most direct expressions of reshaping reality. A powerful will can remake matter. Now he understood. It wasn't just matter. It was reality itself. Spatial transfiguration is one of the advanced applications. McGonagall returned to her chair and sat down. The underlying principle is similar to material transfiguration. Understand space's structural properties, then guide its transformation through magic. But the difficulty is far greater. Space has no fixed material basis. Its structure is more abstract, more dependent on the wizard's perception and understanding. Chapter 120, Easter Holiday. Regulus nodded. It was like painting. Rendering a physical object was straightforward because there was something to reference. Painting an abstract concept was harder because the artist had to build the framework of understanding from scratch. His mind was still turning over what he'd witnessed. One thing was now confirmed, that his spatial magic hadn't gone unnoticed either. That didn't surprise him. It only reinforced what he already suspected. Dumbledore's hand was behind this. McGonagall had been showing him what transfiguration could do to space. Then she continued. Truly advanced transfiguration doesn't rely entirely on understanding, because some things can never be fully understood. The flow of time. The trajectory of fate. The nature of the soul. Yet a skilled transfiguration master can still exert influence over them. Regulus snapped back to the present, frowning. If you don't understand something, how can you transfigure it? Through intuition. Through conviction. Through the mystery inherent in magic itself. Her tone stayed even, but something steady and sure flickered behind her eyes as she spoke. Transfiguration, taken to its furthest point, touches the essence of magic. The part that can't be fully parsed by logic or captured by knowledge. Her gaze settled on him, serious. But that doesn't mean you can skip the foundations. Quite the opposite. The stronger your base, the greater the chance you'll reach that point at all. Regulus nodded. He understood the principle. There was no such thing as advanced ability appearing from nothing. Every breakthrough was built on layers of accumulated work. McGonagall drew another notebook from her drawer. This one was older than the last, bound in dark brown leather that had softened with age. Like the previous one, there are no specific spells or techniques in here. She pushed it across the desk. Only thoughts. Some of the content may be beyond what you can grasp right now, but there's no harm in looking. Regulus took the notebook. It was heavier than he expected. I've emphasized since the first lesson that transfiguration is both rigorous and dangerous. McGonagall went on. What the school teaches is safe, filtered, and verified. But transfiguration itself holds infinite possibility and infinite risk. A flick of her wand, and a transparent crystal sphere materialized on the desk. Inside, a small mass of matter shifted ceaselessly. One moment it flowed like water, the next it burned like fire, then solidified like metal. This is the product of a failed transfiguration experiment. McGonagall's expression turned grave. 14 years ago, a 6th-year Ravenclaw student attempted to fuse life magic with transfiguration. He wanted to create a transfigured creature with a genuine soul. He failed. The product lost stability and began shifting at random, impossible to stop, impossible to reverse. In the end, all that could be done was seal it inside this crystal. The matter inside kept changing. Cotton became mud, mud became smoke, smoke became something else. The student was severely injured. His magic was permanently damaged. He had to leave school. McGonagall put the crystal sphere away. Transfiguration can help you understand the world more deeply. But there are domains you should not enter lightly. Seek to understand the world, and the world will answer. But its answers aren't always what you want. Regulus met her eyes, his voice carrying real weight. Thank you, Professor. You've helped me a great deal. McGonagall nodded. No pleasantries. But the look she gave him was layered with something harder to name. Leaving the office, the owl on his shoulder took flight, circled the corridor once, and settled back on his arm. It had maintained its transfigured state for over half an hour. The magical structure remained stable. On the walk back to the Slytherin dormitory, his mind kept circling back to what he'd seen. Spatial transfiguration. Transfiguration could alter the structure of space. That opened a door he hadn't known existed. His previous research into spatial magic had approached it from the angles of perceiving space, utilizing space, and moving through space. Space warp brought 2 points together. The space anchor charm stabilized local spatial structure. But transfiguration offered a different approach entirely. He didn't have to work within existing spatial structure. He could reshape the structure itself. Compress the space in an area to shorten actual distance. Stretch it so an enemy could never close the gap. Warp it to bend a spell's flight path. Stretch and twist simultaneously, applied directly around a target. Fold it so a wand pointed somewhere it shouldn't. Combined with his spatial awareness, every one of these applications was feasible. He didn't need to replicate McGonagall's approach of pure transfiguration to alter space. He could build on his existing spatial magic foundation and use transfiguration to fine-tune, amplify, or generate effects that neither discipline could produce alone. Empowering old spells with new theory. By the time he reached the dormitory door, several experimental outlines had taken shape in his head. He needed to test transfiguration's effect on space, range, duration, magical cost, and compatibility with spells like space warp. But the prerequisite was being able to perform spatial transfiguration in the first place. So the studying couldn't stop. Knowledge is power. In the wizarding world, that phrase carried weight beyond measure. He pushed open the dormitory door. Cuthbert, Alex, and Hermes were all inside. Cuthbert was grinding through a potions essay. Alex had his nose in a book. Hermes sat on his bed holding an old volume with a black cover. All three looked up when he walked in. Done asking questions? Cuthbert's quill hovered over the parchment. Done. Hermes closed his book. McGonagall giving you private lessons again. More or less. Regulus sat on the edge of his bed without bothering to deflect. Some advanced transfiguration applications. Such as how to turn your wand into a chopstick. Regulus looked at him. Cuthbert laughed. Hermes's mouth twitched, and he slid his wand under his pillow. Can you really do that? Alex asked quietly. In theory, Regulus said. But the target has to not resist, or the power gap has to be massive. He hung up his robes and pulled McGonagall's notebook from his pocket, opening to the first page. No words. Only a drawing, a geometric shape in constant flux, shifting from triangle to square to circle to polygon and back to triangle again. The shape rotated slowly on the page, each transformation accompanied by a faint pulse of magic. It was the concept of change itself, rendered in enchanted ink. Regulus studied the figure, fingertips resting on the paper, feeling the rhythm of the magic flowing through it. The road through Transfiguration was long. But at least now, he could see further along it than before. Outside the window, the sky had gone fully dark. Deep beneath the black lake, the giant squid let out a low, resonant call. The sound traveled through water and stone, arriving in the dormitory as a faint, muffled vibration. Regulus stayed absorbed in the notebook, looking up now and then to think, his fingers tracing wand movements through the air without realizing it. Early April at Hogwarts. Painted eggs adorned the great hall walls, and the Easter holiday was approaching. Regulus, Cuthbert and Alex went together to Slughorn's office to submit their leave requests. The professor settled into his wide armchair, accepted 3 parchment forms, and scanned the reason column through his spectacles. Family matters, all 3. He glanced at them, a knowing smile curling the corner of his mouth. Happy holidays, boys. Slughorn signed the bottom of each form. Do come back on time. Plenty of exciting things waiting for you. He didn't press for details. A Slytherin head of house, seeing 3 pure-blood heirs request leave simultaneously, could fill in the blanks well enough. Likely some combination of inter-family communication, alignment of positions, or the quiet formation of mutual understanding. Especially given the astronomy tower incident, which had also drawn in 2 other pure-blood families. Hermes didn't apply. The Mulciber family was in a delicate position, and facing a pile of complications at home sounded worse than staying at school. He knew what his 3 roommates were going home to discuss. The astronomy tower affair needed to be reported to the families sooner or later. Regulus had written to Orion beforehand. 1 line, coming home for Easter. His father's reply was shorter. A single word, good. The first morning of the holiday, Regulus walked to Hogsmeade Station with Cuthbert and Alex. The platform was nearly empty. The break was short, and few students bothered with the trip. Spending close to 2 days on the train round trip hardly seemed worth it compared to staying at school. Cuthbert and Alex hauled their luggage aboard. Regulus stood at the platform's edge and watched the train pull away. He waited until it vanished around a distant bend and the platform fell silent. Then he turned and walked to an empty corner. Apparition. The crushing pressure lasted less than a second. When his feet touched ground, he was standing on the front steps of 12 Grimmauld Place. The house loomed as it always did. Dark, severe, the black door shut tight, every curtain drawn. Chapter 121, Time will prove the path bonus. Welcome home, young master. Regulus gave it a slight nod, then stepped past and into the entrance hall. Walburga ascended the staircase at a brisk pace, her black dress trailing behind her. Regulus. She stopped in front of him, both hands on his shoulders, eyes scanning him up and down. You've grown. Good color in your face. Mother. He nodded. I'm home. A smile spread across her face, and she pulled him toward the dining room. Orion was already seated at the head of the long table. He looked up when Regulus entered, studied him for a moment, and nodded. Sit. Eat. The meal should have been breakfast by the clock, but it had been prepared as lunch, roast lamb chops, mashed potatoes, and stewed vegetables. Walburga peppered him with questions about school. Course progress, house standings, how things were with his classmates. Regulus answered selectively. Most of what he said had been filtered first, trimmed to what Walburga wanted to hear. Things have settled down inside Slytherin. He cut into a lamb chop. Nobody picks fights anymore. Walburga's eyes lit up. They've seen what you can do. Enough of it, Regulus said. My roommates have come around. They accept where I stand. As they should. Pride rose in her expression. The heir to the House of Black. Everyone ought to know exactly where they rank. The conversation drifted, inevitably, toward Sirius. We haven't crossed paths much this term. I've been focused on studying and practicing. He has his friends. His tone was flat. Just stating facts. For once, Walburga didn't launch into a tirade. She only let out a short huff. Let him do as he pleases. The House of Black has you. Orion ate in silence throughout, glancing up now and then at his wife and son but offering nothing. When the meal ended, he set down his napkin. Regulus, go settle in. My study, half an hour. Yes, father. Regulus returned to his room. It had been just over 3 months since he'd last been here. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Books on the shelves in his preferred order, the desk spotless, the sheets freshly changed. He stood at the window and looked out over Grimmauld Place. He raised a hand to his own face. The lines were sharper than at Christmas, his jaw more defined. He'd grown taller, too. Looking out the window now meant tilting his head slightly down. Half an hour later, he knocked on the study door. "Come in." The room smelled of ink and old books. Behind a massive mahogany desk, Orion sat with a document in hand. He looked up at the sound of the door and gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit." Regulus sat. The desk stretched between them, and the fire crackled in the hearth. Orion set the document aside. "What brings you home?" Regulus began. He started with Hermes getting hurt, moved through the discovery of the passage beneath the astronomy tower, then Darren breaking through the protections. The grey mist erupting. Staying behind to hold the line. The Patroness appearing. Dumbledore arriving. The resentment plague wand being sealed. Orion listened without expression, but his eyes never left his son's face. When Regulus reached Dumbledore's parting words, he watched his father's reaction. Orion gave only a small nod to continue. When he finished, silence filled the study. "The partnership between McNair and Mulciber has collapsed," Regulus summarized. "Darren failed his mission and lost the resentment plague wand on top of it. The Mulciber family may have reached some kind of understanding with Dumbledore. Hermes follows my lead now, which is the Mulciber's way of signaling where they stand." Orion leaned back, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. He nodded. "And the professors?" he asked. "How do they treat you?" "Beyond what's normal," Regulus answered. "Professor McGonagall taught me advanced transfiguration applications, including spatial transfiguration. Professor Sprout showed me rare magical plants and guided the direction of my verdant magic. Professor Flitwick invited me to an advanced charm seminar. Professor Slughorn has been opening doors with his connections." He went on. "If I ask, I get answers. The depth of what they share goes well beyond standard coursework, some of it past Newt level. They know what I'm studying, what I'm thinking about, and instead of stopping me, they help." Orion motioned for him to continue. "That conversation with Dumbledore." Regulus paused to gather his thoughts. It felt more like guidance. He spoke about the path of magic, about power and humility, about Hogwarts being a place where mistakes are allowed. He looked up at his father. "The professors have been good to me," Regulus continued, his voice softening slightly. "Hogwarts has been good to me." Saying it out loud stirred something complicated in his chest, almost contradictory. The feeling was rare for him. He knew why the professors treated him well. He understood the calculation behind it, the expectations, the interests at play. But at the same time, the kindness was real. McGonagall's notebook was real. Sprout's knowledge was real. Flitwick's ideas were real. Dumbledore's guidance was real. Orion understood. He watched his son, and something complicated moved behind his own eyes. "When someone treats you well," Orion said, his voice low, "a rational person feels the pull to repay it. That's human nature, not weakness. The House of Black has declared its position publicly. We stand with Voldemort. That was a family decision, made after weighing every factor. If we reversed course now, I don't need to tell you what would follow." His gaze sharpened on Regulus, carrying an edge of expectation. "I want to know what you think." He wasn't asking Regulus to choose. The choice had been made. He wasn't pressuring his son to pick a side. The side had been picked. He only wanted to understand what was in Regulus's head. And perhaps, to give him room. Regulus was quiet. He stared at the fire. Watched a log split open in the flames, embers drifting upward and vanishing into the chimney. His mind worked fast. With anyone else, he could tailor his words to the situation. But with his father, he owed the truth. Family allegiance. His own path. Dumbledore's expectations. Voldemort's shadow. The professor's goodwill. The power he was still building. Every thread wove into a single, tangled web. My choice hasn't changed. But I won't be herded forward by someone else's hand. When the time comes that I truly need to choose. Images flickered through his mind. Futures that might come to pass. Before that moment arrives, Regulus said, lifting his gaze to meet Orion's, I'll have the power to choose freely. His tone was steady. Like stating a fact that hadn't happened yet but would. Orion stiffened, barely perceptibly. He looked at his son, and something bright flickered in his eyes. He understood what choice Regulus meant. The kind that would wound one side deeply and commit entirely to the other. Even if Regulus didn't want to hurt anyone, someone would force his hand eventually. And the power to choose freely was the power to refuse. He couldn't imagine how strong a person would need to be to pull that off. But given Regulus's current trajectory, the pace of his growth, maybe it was possible. More progress. A note of anticipation crept into his voice. Some. Not as much as I'd like, Regulus said honestly. But the direction is clear now. I know where I'm going, how to get there, and what I need. The rest. The corner of his mouth lifted. Confident, but quiet about it. Not bravado but conviction. Is just walking the road. Orion settled back and let out a long breath. He believed him. His son hadn't been softened by Hogwarts's warmth. Hadn't been led astray by Dumbledore's sugar-coated words. That was a relief. The path ahead was thick with thorns, but Regulus saw them clearly and walked with sure footing. That earned respect. A son like this, how could he not be proud? But until that day comes, Orion said, watching him, we stick to the plan. Understood. Regulus nodded, the weight of the word deliberate. Orion rose and pulled open a drawer, producing a dark wooden box. It was small, its surface marked with fine wood grain. No lock, but Regulus could feel the protective enchantments layered over it. For you. Orion held it out. An Easter gift. Regulus took it and opened the lid. Inside lay a pocket watch. The face bore no numbers, only a pattern of stars, and the hands were slender silver arrows. On the inside of the case lid, a line of small engraved text read, "Time will prove the path. Your grandfather left it to me." Something distant and fond passed through Orion's voice. Now it's yours. No special functions. It just keeps perfect time. He paused. But sometimes, keeping perfect time is enough. Regulus closed the case and slipped the watch into his pocket. Thank you, father. Orion nodded. Any plans for the holiday? Practice. Regulus said. There are things I can't work on at school. Such as Fiend fire. Orion's eyes lifted to him. Surprise surfaced, then faded just as quickly. Be careful, he said. That spell doesn't like to be controlled. I know. Regulus nodded. Chapter 122, Fiend Fire. Back in his room, Regulus shut the door and went to the window. A few muggles passed along the street beyond the square, hurrying even on Easter, always somewhere to be. His father's words echoed in his head. The lines had been drawn long ago. The House of Black stood publicly with Voldemort. Every pure-blood family in Britain knew it. Switching sides now meant open betrayal, and Voldemort's stance on betrayal was something no one in the wizarding world misunderstood. Regulus didn't need to study Voldemort closely. He only needed to look at the evidence. The wizards who had vanished. The Ministry of Magic officials who'd reversed their positions overnight. The dissenters who had simply ceased to exist. At the core of how Voldemort built his authority was a single, non-negotiable clause: disloyalty would not be tolerated. Gone was the leniency of his early recruitment days. What he showed now, more and more openly, was his true face. Cruelty had become routine, violence a tool, absolute obedience an iron law settling into place. Dissent suffocated before it could draw breath. The more terrifying his displays of strength, the more feverish his followers' devotion grew. This version of Voldemort was more popular among the pure-blood circles than ever. He represented what most of those families wanted. He was no longer merely an option. He was becoming the sharpest blade of the pure-blood collective will, cutting down opposition, cementing privilege, purging bloodlines. Their order didn't tolerate betrayal either. And Voldemort was that order's most violent enforcer. Besides, magic was power. In the end, everything circled back to the oldest and most unanswerable law of all. If the House of Black turned now, for any reason, Voldemort wouldn't allow it. Even if it were only to make an example for the other pure-blood families. Even if it were only to uphold the principle that rules couldn't be broken. The Blacks would face destruction. So until he truly possessed the power to choose freely, he couldn't show a single sign. Regulus thought about the Hogwarts professors. The shift this school year had been obvious, or more precisely, it had begun after his patroness was exposed during the Astronomy Tower incident. The patroness had acted like some kind of credential. Once it appeared, something changed in the way Dumbledore looked at him. But Regulus knew himself. A patroness didn't represent all of him. It was a reflection of one facet of his soul. He could stand beneath that spiraling silver light, perfectly calm, and articulate every syllable of the killing curse. Watch green light bloom at his wand tip. He thought again about what Dumbledore had said, that Fawkes seemed interested in him. Phoenixes could see souls, drawn to what was pure and warm. Whether it was the phoenix that had seen something, or Dumbledore projecting his own perception, Regulus couldn't be sure. Either way, the headmaster's regard was translating into tangible advantage. The professor's instruction happened behind closed doors. The most Voldemort could learn was that the younger Black son was studious, asked good questions, and his teachers were fond of him. Voldemort might even approve. A boy who was outwardly humble, handsome, brilliantly talented, beloved by his professors. Like a younger version of himself. But when someone like Voldemort saw another person who resembled him, what would he think? Regulus frowned. While he was still weak, Voldemort might appreciate him. See potential worth cultivating. But once he grew strong enough to register as a threat? A person who mirrored the Dark Lord. Equally distinguished lineage. Equally exceptional talent. Equally valued by his teachers. Equally clear about what he wanted. What would Voldemort think then? He's too much like me. Why would he ever be content as a follower? The answer probably wasn't pleasant. Then again, Voldemort was proud. The kind of pride that came from wielding overwhelming power, from standing at the apex of the wizarding world, from the unshakable conviction that he had surpassed every witch and wizard alive. Proud people tended to look up, or straight ahead. Rarely down. Regulus wasn't yet high enough to cross that downward line of sight. The real question was, what kind of power would give him the freedom to choose? He didn't know the exact threshold. There was no catching up to Voldemort's decades of accumulated magic in a short span, let alone Dumbledore's century of depth. His talent was formidable, yes. But Voldemort's and Dumbledore's talent was equally formidable, perhaps more so, because they'd already proven how far it could take them. Until he had that kind of power, nothing would change. The family's position wouldn't change. Voldemort's expectations wouldn't change. The state of the wizarding world wouldn't change. Regulus shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. He crossed to his desk, sat down, and pulled open the drawer, retrieving a notebook he'd taken from the family library. No name on the cover, but the handwriting and phrasing marked it as the work of some Black ancestor, likely from the 17th or 18th century. He opened it. Inside was a single spell. Fiend fire. His fingers brushed the page, feeling the characters written in enchanted ink. Time had caused the ink to bleed slightly at the edges, but the magical imprint remained sharp. He could sense the emotions and power the writer had poured into every stroke. He read page by page. Fiend fire. One of the most dangerous pieces of dark magic in existence. At its core, it was cursed fire with a will of its own. No fixed incantation. No elaborate preparation required. It was summoned directly through the caster's magic and intent. The flames defaulted to an orange-red, but their temperature and properties bore no resemblance to ordinary fire. Devastatingly destructive. Temperatures far exceeding normal flame. Capable of incinerating magical objects and structures. But Regulus knew it went further than that. Fiend fire could destroy Horcruxes. In the original story, it was the only dark magic explicitly recorded as capable of doing so. Ravenclaw's diadem had been destroyed by fiend fire that spiraled out of control. He read on. The fire possessed self-awareness. It would spontaneously assume the forms of dragons, serpents, chimeras, and other predatory creatures, actively hunting living targets rather than burning passively. It fed on whatever fuel it found, growing stronger the longer it burned. It could not be extinguished. Standard counterspells like augmenti were useless. Only the complete exhaustion of fuel or the caster's death would cause it to die out. No known direct counter curse existed. The risk of backlash was extreme. If the caster's control faltered, the flames would consume them first. Regulus's mind jumped to Vincent Crabbe, lost control, and perished in his own fire. That Slytherin student from the original story. Regulus had met his father, Crabbe, at the Malfoy family's Christmas banquet. Looked at from another angle, though, Vincent Crabbe had accomplished something significant. He'd accidentally destroyed one of Voldemort's Horcruxes without ever knowing it. What separated Fiend fire from conventional fire magic was the curse element. A standard incendio was controllable, limited in power, and would die the moment the caster stopped feeding it magic. Fiend fire, once ignited, broke free of the caster's initial command and became an independent engine of destruction. It belonged to the domain of high-level elemental dark magic. Starting a Fiend fire was easy. With enough raw power and vicious enough intent, anyone could light one. Making it obey, that was another matter entirely. Regulus turned the page. The notebook laid out the hard prerequisites. Magical reserves needed to exceed the level of a mature adult wizard, far beyond what Hogwarts NEWT examinations demanded. A foundation in dark magic theory was essential. The caster had to understand the principles of curses and the binding mechanism between curse and element. Knowing the words wasn't enough. You had to grasp the logic behind them. He measured himself against the criteria. On the magical reserves front, months of meditation had refined his power. His total capacity and recovery rate already surpassed most adult wizards. Dark magic theory, he'd consumed volumes of it. That should suffice. Further in came the training steps. Step 1, Emotional anchoring. Intense negative emotion served as the fire's fuel. Hatred, the desire to destroy, killing intent. Practice was to take place in a secure, sealed environment, a fireproof magical training chamber with nothing combustible, repeatedly synchronizing emotion and magical output. At this stage, no actual flame was to be summoned. The goal was learning to convert emotion into a magical state primed for ignition. His finger paused on this passage. Negative emotion. He didn't harbor any particular, burning hatred. There was no one he needed to kill. Destructive urges and killing intent were even further removed from his nature. But the notebook clarified, emotion was the fuel, not the control mechanism. Ignition required darkness. Control required absolute calm. Step 2, Form testing. Begin with the weakest possible flame. Use willpower to constrain its shape, keeping it as a simple fire, preventing it from morphing into a predatory form. This stage required continuous injection of magic to prevent the fire from expanding on its own. The moment control felt like it was slipping, terminate immediately with finite incantatum. A note had been scrawled in the margin beside this section: 9 out of 10 learners die at this step. Either their magic runs dry and the fire turns on them, or their will wavers and the fire swallows them whole. Step 3, Controlled summoning. Gradually increase the fire's intensity. Attempt to guide it into a single form, such as a small serpent, and issue simple commands, like burning in a circle. If it failed, evacuate immediately. Don't try to salvage the situation. On the subject of evacuation, the notebook was blunt. The only reliable emergency response was to get out. Fiend fire spread at terrifying speed. The caster needed to clear the burn radius immediately, with no attempt to stand and fight. Alternatively, terrain could be used for isolation. If instant escape wasn't possible, redirect the fire toward an area with nothing to burn, stone clearings or zones behind magical barriers, buying time to flee. But the fire would navigate around obstacles on its own, hunting its target. Chapter 123, A Single Flame Bonus. Regulus turned to the next page. Protection: Fiend fire could be defended against, blocked with a raw magical barrier, but only by the most exceptional wizards alive. The notebook named no one specifically. Perhaps no wizard of that caliber existed in the author's era. But Regulus knew better. Dumbledore could hold against Fiend fire, at least briefly. During their duel at the Ministry of Magic, Dumbledore had blocked Voldemort's fire serpent, though he couldn't sustain the defense indefinitely and still had to redirect or retreat. The notebook also mentioned reverse manipulation: in extreme circumstances, a wizard who surpassed the original caster in both will and magical power could forcibly redirect the flames. Dumbledore again. He'd done exactly that against Voldemort's Fiend fire, overpowering it outright. For any ordinary wizard, the feat was impossible. Regulus sat with that for a moment. On that point alone, Dumbledore was stronger than Voldemort. Fiend fire was already close to unstoppable, and Voldemort's version of it had still been suppressed. The level of power that implied. He shook his head and reeled his wandering thoughts back in. He read on. Control techniques: the essence of Fiend fire control was the caster's will imposing dominance over cursed flame. In the original story, the only confirmed successes belonged to Voldemort and Dumbledore. But this black ancestor had compiled detailed enough notes to suggest he'd managed it himself. 4 core principles. Will as command: control hinged on absolute, unwavering focus. The caster had to continuously transmit clear directives to the flame: burn only within this area, do not attack this target. The slightest lapse in concentration and the fire would break free instantly. Emotional separation: the negative emotions used to summon the fire had to be severed from the controlling will. Darkness was fuel for ignition only. Once the flame existed, the caster needed to shift into cold rationality. Emotional overflow would trigger backlash. Form simplification: in early stages, the caster had to prevent the fire from splitting into multiple predatory shapes, which would fracture focus. Maintaining a single form, a wall of flame or a lone fire serpent, reduced the space for the fire's independent will to rebel. Precise magical output: during the control phase, magic had to flow in a steady, even stream. No surges. Fluctuations in output would agitate the flame into greater violence. Regulus finished the section and took stock. Will as command. The mental fortitude forged through star-guided meditation was sufficient. Emotional separation. He could compartmentalize. Shifting between rational and emotional states was something he'd practiced. Form simplification. Acceptable. Precise magical output. That was his strongest suit. All 4 requirements. He met them. His mind drifted briefly to Grindelwald's blue fire. That was a different spell entirely. Fiend fire was offensive cursed dark magic. Grindelwald's blue flames were Protego Diabolica, a high-level variant of dark defensive magic. Different in nature altogether. With a clear picture of what he was dealing with, he could begin. That evening, Regulus found Orion. "I want to practice Fiend fire," he said without preamble. Orion had been reviewing documents in his study. He looked up, held his son's gaze for a beat, then nodded. "Follow me." They walked through the long corridors of the house and descended to the second basement level. This floor saw little use. A single heavy stone door stood at the end, its surface carved thick with protective runes. A tap of Orion's wand and the door slid open without a sound. Beyond it lay a spacious training chamber, roughly 20 meters square. Walls, floor, and ceiling were all the same slate grey stone, polished smooth, bare of decoration. The air carried a faint magical residue, the lingering trace of protective charms cast over years. Orion stepped inside and began casting, his wand moving in rapid succession. With each incantation, another layer of light bloomed across the walls, each a different color, stacking together into a dense protective barrier. Regulus could feel the space seal shut around them. Magical fluctuations dampened. Even the movement of air slowed. When the preparations were complete, Orion retreated to the chamber's edge and leaned against the stone wall. "Go ahead." He looked at Regulus and nodded. "I'll be watching." Regulus walked to the center. He closed his eyes first, steadied his breathing, and let the star-guided meditation cycle engage. The 4.5-star model of Orion's belt ignited in his mind. Magic flowed along the paths, and his focus sharpened to a fine edge. Then he reached for negative emotion. This was the difficult part. He had no consuming hatred. No desperate need to destroy. But he could simulate it. Not generate the emotion itself, but use his magic to replicate its wavelength. He thought of the grey mist beneath the astronomy tower. Those faces. That despair and suffering. His magic stirred, taking on something cold and corrosive. An inclination toward destruction. Not enough. He thought of Voldemort. The darkness that name carried. The crushing pressure. The implicit threat, obey or die. His magic surged harder, gaining an aggressive edge. Still not enough. Finally, he thought of himself. What failure would look like? If he didn't have enough power when the moment came. If the family was dragged deeper. If Sirius, his parents, or even he himself. His magic boiled over, flooding with a raw, tearing impulse to shatter everything that stood in the way. Now. His eyes opened. Wand rose. Will and magic locked together. The air at the center of the chamber warped. Space itself trembled. A point of orange-red light materialized from nothing, hovering half a meter off the ground, no larger than a fingernail. It began to swell. Orange-red deepened to bright orange. Temperature spiked. The air inside the chamber superheated. The flame started to change. Vague shapes rippled across its surface, like countless tiny serpents writhing, straining outward, trying to break free of the core, trying to become independent. Regulus pressed his wand down. His will became an invisible fist, clamping down on every tendril that tried to split away. The fire fought back. Temperature climbed higher. Waves of heat slammed against the protective barriers, which flickered in response. The air had grown too hot to breathe. Regulus cast a bubblehead charm on himself. Against the far wall, Orion did the same. Hold! Magic poured out in a steady, even stream. Will locked tight. His mind held a single thought: maintain this shape, nothing else. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The fire began to stabilize. The serpentine shapes across its surface receded, and it settled back into a simple flame, though deeper in color than ordinary fire and far, far hotter. At 45 seconds, he was at his limits. His reserves were fine, but the mental strain of sustaining that level of suppression had peaked. He swept his wand downward. The flame died. Vanished in an instant. Temperature plummeted, and the residual heat began to dissipate through the chamber. Regulus lowered his wand, breathing slightly harder than usual. First attempt. 45 seconds. The fire hadn't escaped his control, but it hadn't been fully tamed either. In those final seconds, he'd felt it gathering strength, coiling to break through. Orion walked over. Said nothing. Placed a hand on his shoulder. Good. Keep going. Over the next 3 days, Regulus spent 6 hours a day in the training chamber. On the second day, he held the flame for a full minute. The shape stayed more stable, and his temperature control sharpened. But when he tried to move it, it failed. The flame drifted 5 centimeters to the left and immediately swelled, nearly tearing free. On the third day, he managed to guide the fire in slow movement through the chamber, like a drifting lantern. But the trajectory was stiff. Turns required pauses. It was nowhere close to fluid control. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Regulus stood at the center of the chamber, wand raised, palm facing up. An orange-red flame kindled 3 centimeters above his open hand. It was the size of a candle flame. Deep in color. Burning steady. No flickering, no distortion. A quiet, controlled point of cursed fire. His fingers shifted. The flame followed. The path was smooth, unbroken, as though guided by an invisible thread. He turned his palm downward. The flame hung in the air. Didn't fall. Didn't spread. It held its position. Then he pushed further. He split the flame into 3 smaller points, each moving independently, weaving simple geometric patterns through the air before merging back into one. He compressed the flame from fist-sized down to a walnut, density increasing, temperature soaring. The chamber's protective barriers hummed in warning. He eased off. Let the flame expand back to its original size. The entire sequence lasted 3 minutes. When it was over, Regulus closed his fist. The flame winked out without a sound. Not even smoke. The chamber settled into stillness. Only the runes on the walls still glowed faintly, recording what had taken place. Orion stood against the wall, staring at the spot above his son's palm where the fire had burned. He stared for a long time. Then he crossed the room, placed his hand on Regulus's shoulder, and pressed down hard. That's enough for now. Something restrained but fierce ran through his voice. Step 1 is solid. Regulus nodded. He didn't speak, but he knew the truth. This was only the beginning. A small flame and the fiend fire beasts summoned in real combat were worlds apart. But it proved the path was walkable. Proved his will was strong enough, his magical control precise enough, to tame one of the most dangerous forces in the wizarding world. The rest was practice, accumulation, and gradual escalation. 2 more days of training followed. By the end, he could reliably control a fist-sized fiend fire through complex operations, movement, shape-shifting, temperature modulation, splitting and merging. All smooth. But scaling up was another matter. When he tried to summon a flame the size of a football, the difficulty spiked exponentially. 20 seconds in and he nearly lost it. He understood. This would take time. Fiend fire wasn't a spell you rushed. It demanded long-term practice, letting body and mind adapt to the sustained pressure. On the last morning of the Easter holiday, Regulus packed his things and said his goodbyes. Walburga rattled off a string of reminders. Show your strength, uphold the family honor, don't bury yourself in books all the time. Orion offered a single sentence, write if you need anything. Regulus nodded and walked to the open ground beyond the front door. Apparition. The crushing pressure passed in an instant. His feet touched down on the hillside outside Hogwarts. The April morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of earth and new grass. In the distance, the castle's spires drifted in and out of the mist. He started walking toward the gates. Chapter 124, Power Must Be Pursued. The corridors had that end of holiday looseness to them. Young witches and wizards shuffled along with slack footsteps, sweet wrappers piled half-opened in the corners of common rooms, and even the green glow filtering up from the black lake looked lazy. Regulus was the first back to the dormitory. Cuthbert and Alex were taking the train and wouldn't arrive until evening. Hermes wasn't in the room. No telling where he'd gone. Regulus freshened up briefly and headed straight for the library. Madame Pants was perched on a ladder, dusting the topmost shelf with a feather duster that sent fine motes drifting through the light. He made his way to the ancient runes section and pulled out detailed explanation of defensive magic associated with Nordic runes. The page edges had begun to curl. When he cracked it open, a yellowed borrowing card slipped out. The last entry was dated 1962. He read all morning. The Great Hall was sparse at lunch. He ate, then continued through the afternoon. By dusk the candles had been lit, and the long tables were filling up. Cuthbert and Alex squeezed through the main doors, rain still darkening the shoulders of their robes. They spotted Regulus and walked over quickly. "You're early," Cuthbert said, dropping onto the bench. "Our carriage got caught in a downpour halfway here." Alex pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his face. "Almost May and it's still freezing." Regulus carved off a piece of chicken. "Scottish weather has never made sense." The spread was generous. Beef drippings soaked into mashed potatoes, and pumpkin juice sloshed in silver pitchers. Dumbledore rose from the table, his long silver beard swaying against his chest. "The holidays were wonderful," his voice carried across the hall, "but they are over. Owls and Newt students, you have less than 2 months of revision remaining. Lower years would do well to refocus as well. Professor McGonagall and Professor Slughorn have asked me to remind you that your Transfiguration and Potions essays are due next week." A few whistles rose from the Gryffindor table. James Potter hoisted his fork overhead and waved it around. Sirius tipped his head back to gulp pumpkin juice, and the two bumped shoulders, laughing. When Regulus's gaze drifted over, Sirius was wiping the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. Their eyes met. His grin froze for a fraction of a second before he turned away. Regulus looked back at his plate. Cuthbert leaned closer, voice low. "I told my family about what happened over the holiday." He prodded the peas on his plate with his fork, eyes flicking toward the staff table to make sure no one was paying attention. Alex stopped chewing too. "After my father heard everything, he locked me in the house for 5 solid days." A thread of pride wound through Cuthbert's voice. "Made me drill Protego 8 hours a day. My wand was practically burning by the end." He tipped his chin toward Hermes. "I can cast it now too." Hermes was slicing his steak with deliberate care. He didn't look up. "Your family didn't say anything else? About the fallout?" "They did." Cuthbert set down his fork and turned to Regulus, expression sobering. "My father asked me to thank you on his behalf. He said he'd visit Grimmauld Place personally to speak with Mr. Black." "Mr. Cuthbert is too kind," Regulus said. Alex swallowed what was in his mouth and wiped his hands on his robes before speaking. "My family reacted differently." His voice dropped. "My father heard me out, then told me never to bring it up again. Not to anyone." He stole a glance at Regulus, color rising in his cheeks. "But he also told me to thank you. And to say he's grateful you looked out for me." Regulus nodded. "Mr. Rosier is too generous." Hermes set down his knife and fork. "I want to find somewhere to practice." He looked at Regulus. "Tonight." Regulus knew what he meant. The room of requirement. And more than that, Hermes wanted to train with him. Cuthbert and Alex had gone still too. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Regulus lifted his goblet and took a sip of pumpkin juice. The warm sweetness slid down his throat. "Are you two coming?" He glanced at Cuthbert and Alex. They exchanged a look. Cuthbert nodded first. Alex pressed his lips together and gave a quiet "Then rest up," Regulus said. 8 o'clock. 8th floor corridor, in front of the tapestry. On the way back to the Slytherin common room, Cuthbert was going on about a Quidditch match from the holiday while Alex chimed in with questions. Regulus walked half a step ahead, listening to the voices behind him, his mind turning over something else entirely. Hermes wanted power. The want was urgent, almost ravenous. Nothing wrong with that. Everyone should want power. But the shape of Hermes's wanting was different. In his mind, dark magic was the only real power. The kind that could tear flesh, drain marrow, force someone to their knees. It didn't matter that Regulus had blocked his dark magic with Protego. Hermes still believed dark magic was the pinnacle worth chasing. That conviction ran deep. Bone deep. Regulus didn't deny its effectiveness. Dark magic was fast-acting, easy to learn, easy to use. One incantation, a flash of light, and the opponent dropped. No need for years of transfiguration practice, no need to memorize hundreds of potion formulas, no need for especially precise magical control. If you had the nerve to cast and the power to fuel it, it worked. But for most wizards, dark magic was borrowed strength. Exhilarating when you took it out, but the interest came due eventually. That interest might be your rationality, your emotional stability, or the day you caught yourself smiling in the mirror and couldn't recognize the person staring back. Regulus thought of a bros Mulciber. The Mulciber family's reliance on dark magic was no secret. Their ancestral basement probably overflowed with dark artifacts. Their children likely started learning the theory behind curses at 6 years old. Hermes had grown up in that environment. Naturally, he'd internalized the importance of power early. Or more accurately, the importance of without power, you die. So of course he was urgent. Of course he was hungry. But Cuthbert and Alex were nothing like Hermes. For them, magic was air. They'd been breathing it since birth, so the idea of practicing how to breathe had never occurred to them. Pure-blood children were all the same. Magical awakening was a foregone conclusion. The Hogwarts acceptance letter was a foregone conclusion. Learning basic spells was a foregone conclusion. Everything was a road laid out in advance, and the scenery along it had lost its novelty long ago. They'd drill Protego because their families demanded it. They'd follow Regulus to the room of requirement because he led the way. But without someone pushing, they'd rather play wizard's chess in the common room or scheme ways to wheedle extra pudding out of the kitchen house elves. That wasn't their fault. Regulus thought of Walburga's teachings. She preached pure blood supremacy, preached black family glory, but never explained why one should grow strong. In her view, strength was a gift that came with bloodline, like the galleons sitting in the vault. Born into it. Just had to inherit. So the laziness Cuthbert and Alex showed wasn't really laziness. It was the product of an education missing its most critical piece. No one had ever told them that magic wasn't an inheritance. That it had to be earned through effort. That it would betray you on the very day you needed it to save your life. After the astronomy tower incident, they'd been shaken for a while. Cuthbert woke early every day to practice spells. Alex gnawed through the standard book of spells until midnight. But fear fades. A month later, Cuthbert started complaining about why he still had to practice the impediment jinx. Alex's study time gradually gave way to collecting chocolate frog cards. Regulus had said nothing. He could have ordered them. With his current standing, one sentence about adding 2 hours of daily practice and they'd obey. But there was no point. A wrist raised under duress never learned precision. A spell memorized under supervision was the first one forgotten in a real fight. Power had to be reached for. By your own hand. Those who couldn't reach it either hadn't fallen hard enough, or simply didn't want to. At 5 to 8, 4 of them gathered in the 8th floor corridor. The stretch of wall opposite the tapestry. I need a place to practice magic. Regulus repeated it 3 times in his mind and began to pace. A door frame materialized in the wall. He pushed it open. Inside was a spacious training room. Dark wood flooring. Padded walls on all sides. High ceiling with smokeless torches hanging from brackets. One side of the room held a row of wooden practice dummies. The other had a weapon rack, though it stood empty, its frame carved with intertwining serpents. Cuthbert let out a low whistle. Regulus walked in and raised his hand. His wand slid from his sleeve into his palm. We'll start with Protego. Cuthbert, show us what the holiday produced. Cuthbert stepped to the center of the room, took a deep breath, and raised his wand. Protego. Silver light burst from the tip, rapidly spreading into a translucent barrier. The shape was uneven, edges rippling like disturbed water, but it held. The shield lasted nearly a minute before cracks appeared. A second later it shattered into points of light. Cuthbert let out a breath, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were bright. How was that? Your output's unstable. Regulus stepped closer and tapped Cuthbert's wrist with his wand. You're forcing it. Protego doesn't need brute strength to hold open. You have to guide the magic so it flows through the shield. He raised his own wand in demonstration. No incantation. A layer of silver film snapped open instantly, smooth as a mirror. See? Relax the wrist. Cuthbert tried again. This time the barrier was thinner, but it lasted an extra half-minute before dissolving. Alex spoke up quietly from the side. I still can't cast it. Then start with Lumos. Regulus turned to him. But don't just think about lighting the tip. Try controlling the brightness. Dimmest to brightest, 10 levels. Hold each one for 3 seconds. Chapter 125, An Uneasy Morning Bonus. Hermes had already moved to the practice dummies. A low incantation, and a thin dark red thread shot from his wand tip, coiling around the wooden figure's neck, biting half an inch into the wood with a hissing, corrosive sizzle. A variant of bone and blood stripping. Regulus walked over. Weakened version. Hermes didn't stop. The thread split into 3 more strands, each binding a different limb. I want to see if I can control multiple targets at once. Right idea, but your distribution's off. Regulus studied the strands. They looked the same thickness, but the one on the left leg was clearly underpowered. You're still funneling most of your magic into the first strand without realizing it. Try splitting near focus. Imagine you have 4 independent hands, each controlling one. Hermes released the spell. He stood thinking for a moment, then closed his eyes, brow furrowing tight. After a while, he opened them and cast again. Bone and blood stripping. 4 dark red threads. The power distribution was more even this time, biting into the wood at nearly identical depths. Training continued. Cuthbert drilled the impediment jinx, aiming at a copper ring hanging on the far side of the room. Alex's wand tip flickered on and off like a half-dead firefly. Hermes was already attempting a 5th strand. Regulus backed up to the wall, leaning against the padding to watch. Cohesion wasn't built only in battle. It was also built in failing together, in watching someone's wand spit sparks and laughing about it. But he needed to train too. Standard magic could wait. The things he didn't want seen, though. A thought, barely more than a nudge. Deep in the training room, a stone wall slid silently into place, partitioning off a smaller chamber. The door was tucked into shadow, nearly invisible. If the need arose, he could slip inside to practice verdant magic, his patroness, space warp, all the things that weren't ready for an audience yet. Cuthbert finally hit the copper ring. Got it. He spun toward Regulus, grinning wide. Did you see that? Regulus nodded. Good. Keep going. Moving targets next. A flick of his wand, and a dozen small wooden balls dropped from the ceiling on thin cords, swinging in unpredictable patterns. Cuthbert groaned but raised his wand anyway. Alex's lumos had finally stabilized at the 5th brightness level. He wiped the sweat away and asked quietly, "Is this right?" "It is," Regulus confirmed. "Tomorrow, try rapid switching between different levels." By 9:30, Hermes was drained. His face had gone pale. Cuthbert and Alex were too spent to lift their arms. The 4 of them left the room of requirement. No one spoke on the walk back to the dungeons. Footsteps echoed through the stone passageways, overlapping and fading. Near the Slytherin entrance, Hermes broke the silence. "When's the next session?" "Friday." Regulus looked at him. "Wednesday too, if you can handle it." "I can handle it." Hermes nodded firmly. The common room fire was still burning. A handful of 7th years huddled in a corner, speaking low. They glanced up as the 4 came in, then turned back to their conversation. Through the archway, down the dormitory corridor. Regulus pushed open the door. Green light from the black lake rippled through the window, wavering across the walls. The beds were already made. House elves had been through. He hung up his outer robe, sat on the edge of his bed, and raised his right hand. Palm up. The faintest shift of intent. A point of orange-red flame kindled from nothing, no larger than a fingernail, hovering 3 inches above his skin. White-hot at its core, edged in gold. The temperature was perfectly contained. Not even the fine hairs on his palm curled. Fiend fire. He watched it for 5 seconds, then let it dissolve. Lying back, he caught movement beyond the glass. A giant squid glided past, tentacles trailing across the window. His eyes closed. Consciousness sank into that familiar field of stars. The 4 stars of Orion's constellation glowed in the dark. The 5th, Bellatrix, was growing denser by the day. It's his first night back at school. He should sleep well. The first Monday of May dawned absurdly clear. Sunlight poured through the great hall's high windows, scattering gold across the silverware on the long tables. That was when the owls flooded in. Along with the mail came stray feathers and the occasional dropping. One unlucky student caught a hit, drawing laughter from the tables nearby. Regulus was spreading jam on his toast. Cuthbert was copying his charms essay. Alex had his face buried in a bowl of porridge. Hermes dragged his fork through scrambled eggs, staring at some invisible point on the table. The owls landed. Parcels, letters, the latest edition of the Daily Prophet. For a few moments there was only the rustle of paper. Then a strangled sob rose from the Ravenclaw table. Regulus looked up. A second-year girl had pressed a hand over her mouth, shoulders beginning to shake. The students beside her leaned in to read the paper. Their faces changed too. Someone reached out to rub her back. Someone else scooted their chair away. The murmuring spread like a tide, rolling from Ravenclaw to Hufflepuff to Gryffindor. "Let me see that." Cuthbert reached toward a 4th year nearby, who handed the paper over with an odd expression. Cuthbert flipped to page 3. The headline ran across the middle of the page: Wizarding family attacked in London suburb, victims receiving medical treatment. The article was short, crammed between a broomstick advertisement and a ministry budget notice. Last night, a wizarding residence near Hampstead Heath was broken into. Significant magical damage was found inside the home, and a small number of magical items were stolen. The homeowner, Callan Thorne, and his wife, Lyra Thorne, sustained injuries and have been transferred to St. Mungo's, where their condition is reported as stable. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes has opened an investigation. No information regarding the attacker's identity or motive has been released. 2 lines tacked onto the end: strong traces of dark magic were detected at the scene. Several defensive enchantments had been violently breached using methods described as highly destructive. Cuthbert pushed the paper toward Regulus. Alex leaned over to read, then said quietly, "I know her. Ileana Thorne. 2nd year Ravenclaw. Her father works in the Ministry's Magical Items Review Department. Her mother does clerical work for the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." His voice went heavy. "Our families had dinner together last year." Regulus nodded and let his gaze sweep the hall. At the Ravenclaw table, 7 or 8 people had gathered around Ileana. The half-bloods and muggleborns were the ones comforting her, passing handkerchiefs, speaking softly. The pure-blood students sat where they were. Some continued eating. Others turned to whisper to their neighbors, eyes flicking toward Ileana and darting away again. That deliberate distance carried something colder than indifference. Hufflepuff wore its sympathy openly, though the voices stayed low. A few 7th years shook their heads. Middle-year girls huddled together to whisper. The way they looked toward Ravenclaw held concern, but more than that, the relief of "thank God it wasn't us." Over at Gryffindor, James Potter was already on his feet. His fist slammed the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "It's those lunatics again." Loud enough for half the hall to hear. Sirius rose with him. Lupin grabbed his arm and said something, but couldn't hold him back. More students crowded around their section of the table, boys and girls alike, the same anger written across every face. The Slytherin table was quiet. But it was the wrong kind of quiet. They were holding something in. A cluster of 6th and 7th years sat at the far end, exchanging glances. The faintest curve at the corners of their mouths. They didn't look toward Ravenclaw, didn't join the discussion, barely touched the newspaper. But the air of "I know exactly what this is about" clung to them, unmistakable from 10 feet away. The middle years were less subtle. A few struggling half-bloods and some pure-bloods kept their heads down, forks poking mechanically at their plates. But the students from core pure-blood families, their eyes were bright, bodies leaning forward, like hounds that had caught the scent of blood. Narcissa Black cast a single look from the head of the table. Her gaze swept over the restless middle years, and they straightened immediately, expressions smoothing out. Lucretius Burke rapped his knuckles on the tabletop. Not loud, but everyone in his radius heard it. Then he went back to buttering his toast, slow and unhurried. Dumbledore tapped his goblet. The clear chime cut through every sound in the hall. The headmaster stood. Blue eyes behind spectacles swept the room. He waited until the last whisper died before speaking. Hogwarts is a school. His voice carried, firm, not gentle, edged with warning. Within these walls, you are students. A student's duty is to learn, to grow, and to understand that magic is not merely power. It is responsibility. His gaze lingered on the Gryffindor table, then passed over Slytherin. The outside world holds conflict, suffering, and injustice. But none of that belongs inside this castle. At Hogwarts, you have one identity and one only. You are students. He turned toward Ravenclaw. Professor Flitwick. Professor Flitwick slid from his chair and walked briskly to Ileana Thorne. He patted her shoulder, murmured a few words, then guided her toward the doors. As they passed the Gryffindor table, James opened his mouth to speak. A single look from Professor McGonagall pinned him in place. The doors of the Great Hall opened and closed. Chapter 126, Waiting for someone to make a move. The silence held for a beat, then the murmuring surged back. This time, every house was looking at the Slytherin table. Some openly, some trying not to. Anger, suspicion, resentment, curiosity. The Slytherin students met those stares. A few even sat up straighter. A cluster of fifth-year boys bumped shoulders, smirks tugging at their mouths. The way they looked at the Muggle-born students at the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw tables was the way someone might look at objects in a display case. A little curious. Mostly cruel. Regulus turned back to his toast. Cuthbert folded the newspaper and set it on the table. He'd stopped eating. His father held a senior position in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, leading the response team for magical exposure incidents in the Muggle world. Not a small job. The Avery family belonged to the rationalist wing. They believed in pure-blood dominance, that purebloods were more gifted, their lineage cleaner, and that they deserved to lead. But the rationalists didn't advocate violent purges. Mixed bloods could be absorbed. Muggleborns needed strict vetting. Extreme measures only damaged pure-blood credibility and drove the ministry's centrists to the other side. Cuthbert had been raised on this philosophy. He looked down on those of impure blood, thought them dirty, thought they didn't understand the traditions and customs of the wizarding world. But he'd never wished them dead in their homes. He didn't see the attack on a ministry official's family as cause for celebration. Alex was restless, picking up his fork and putting it down again. His porridge had gone cold, a skin forming across the surface. The Rosier branch family didn't carry much weight. They sat at the margins of the pure-blood circle. That position made him acutely sensitive to conflict. Any shift in the wind could sweep a small family like his into the grinder. Hermes was indifferent. He finished his eggs, wiped his mouth with a napkin, folded it neatly beside his plate. The attack registered the way a forest fire in the distance registers. You could see the smoke, but the flames weren't close enough to feel. Dark magic, violence, casualties. In his framework, these were expressions of power. Nothing that warranted extra emotion. Regulus drained the last of his pumpkin juice and stood. Cuthbert, Alex, and Hermes rose with him. As the four of them moved along the table, eyes followed from every direction. Regulus kept his gaze forward. He knew this would fester. Similar stories had appeared in the paper before, but to young witches and wizards they'd always been something that happened out there, filtered through a layer of newsprint, not quite real. Today that layer had torn. The attack had happened to a classmate's parents. That classmate sat among them, shared their lessons, ate at the next table over. The distance had collapsed. Hogwarts was not going to stay quiet. In History of Magic, Professor Binns droned through the textbook in his flat, colorless voice. The sun was too warm through the windows, pulling everyone toward sleep. Regulus felt eyes on him. 2 rows ahead and to the left, a pair of Ravenclaw boys had turned to stare. The look on their faces was hard to read. He didn't lift his head. They turned back around, voices dropping low. Fragments drifted over. Slytherin, definitely knows. The bell rang. Professor Binns drifted straight through the blackboard and vanished. Students poured into the corridor, bottlenecking at the door. On the way back to the Slytherin common room, Narcissa stepped out from a side passage. Regulus. Her voice was soft. Cuthbert and the others glanced over. Regulus nodded for them to go ahead and turned to face her. She drew him to one side of the corridor. The atmosphere outside has shifted. Narcissa didn't waste time. She wore dark green robes today, the Black family crest pinned at her collar, hair swept back without a strand out of place. Both sides are sitting on a powder keg, but it won't hold much longer. The hardliners in the ministry are waiting for a pretext. So is the other side. Her eyes stayed on Regulus while she spoke, peripheral vision sweeping the corridor. If someone approaches you in the coming days, tries to pull you into something, her tone stayed gentle, think it through before you decide. Some doors don't open back up once you walk through. She didn't give specific advice. Didn't say join. Didn't say stay away. She laid out the landscape and left the rest to him. Regulus nodded. Thank you, cousin. I understand. Narcissa reached out and straightened his collar, though it hadn't been crooked. She withdrew her hand, turned, and walked away. Regulus returned to the common room. The fire in the hearth was burning high. A handful of upper years sat clustered nearby, voices hushed and charged at the same time. He settled into the sofa by the window. Beyond the glass, the green glow of the Black Lake shimmered and swayed. The attack on the Thorn family probably wasn't complicated. Death Eaters sending a message to ministry officials who weren't cooperating enough. A show of force. A reminder to everyone that fence-sitting had consequences. It had happened before. It would happen again. Snape had mentioned it earlier in the year, voices inside Slytherin calling to take out the trash. Now, those two threads might be converging. The moment the Daily Prophet printed photos of the Thorn House alongside descriptions of dark magic traces and put it in every student's hands, it became an ignition point. Certain people would read the attack as a signal. A clear one. The pure-blood students who weren't thinking straight. The middle years itching to prove themselves. The fanatics who believed pure-blood glory had to be written in violence. They'd treat it as a bugle call. Purge the Mudbloods. Purge the Muggleborns. Purge everyone contaminating magical bloodlines. The slogans could sound righteous. The action could come fast. Regulus had no doubt they'd go through with it. Once people submerged into a group, thinking got easy to abandon. Individual judgment surrendered to collective emotion. People who were perfectly normal on their own could whip each other into a frenzy, knock back a couple of fire whiskies, and march into the corridors with wands drawn to corner someone. But whoever was leading wouldn't be stupid. The person behind the scenes, the one assembling these people, issuing directives, planning the moves, wouldn't be a simple fanatic. What they wanted probably had little to do with blood purity. What they wanted was status. Influence within Slytherin. Clout among the upper years. Weight in the Death Eater pipeline. They might be performing for a senior Death Eater. They might be pledging loyalty directly to Voldemort. Voldemort was already making contact with students approaching graduation. Regulus knew that much. A few seventh years already bore the dark mark on their left forearms. That mark wasn't a tattoo. It was a contract, a locator, an identity stamp, a brand seared into the soul. It bound scattered individuals into an organization, the shared symbol hammering home a single message: we are on the same side. For young witches and wizards, the pull of that belonging was immense. You were no longer alone. You belonged to something larger, something powerful, something with a noble cause. Restore pure blood glory. Reshape the Wizarding Order. Inside it you found comrades, validation, a sense of purpose. Even if that purpose required hurting people. Even if the organization would eventually spend you like ammunition. In the moment, the feeling of being needed was enough to blind you to the cost. It was brainwashing, but done carefully and cleverly. No one forced you. They drew you in instead. They showed you the shiny outside and hid what was bad underneath. By the time you realized what was really going on, it was already too late to leave. Regulus had spent this school year too quietly. No one challenged him anymore. No one dared test his limits. That kind of calm wasn't normal. Conflict was inevitable. Only a question of when. Someone would make a move. Maybe to stir up trouble, dragging the war outside the walls into the school. Maybe to climb over Regulus's reputation: look, I dared to challenge the Black Heir. Maybe to perform for Voldemort, proving they were more worthy than the not fanatical enough younger Black son. The Black family had enemies, of course. But Regulus needed this opportunity. Whether it was a brainless thug, a calculating schemer, someone nursing an old grudge against the Blacks, or someone who simply didn't like his face, it didn't matter who came. Anyone would do. As long as the other side struck first, Regulus could turn it to his advantage. Keep the conflict inside a framework. Display strength. Eliminate a latent threat. Draw a line for anyone still watching from the sidelines. Don't come for me. But all of that was tactics. What truly mattered was power. The cards in Regulus's hand fell into two categories, the magic he'd mastered, and the weight of the Black name. An ancient pureblood family's connections, holdings, political capital. But strip it down, and the second depended on the first. If he wasn't strong enough on his own, the family name was nothing more than scenery. Power was the foundation of everything. Chapter 127, Layering Spatial Magic Bonus. After afternoon classes, the four of them gathered in the room of requirement again. Cuthbert and Alex were sparring. Cuthbert's protego could hold for about 2 minutes now, the edges still wavered, but the shape was solid. Alex's full body bind curse struck at dead center, white sparks bursting on impact. The barrier shuddered but held. Again. Cuthbert called. Alex raised his wand. Petrificus totalis. This time the trajectory drifted, grazing the edge of the barrier and sailing past to hit the wooden training dummy behind him. The dummy's chest turned grey, then faded back to normal. Cuthbert dropped his shield and wiped the sweat from his forehead. See? I can block it now. Yet. Alex nodded, expression serious. But that dark spell Hermes uses. Last week, Hermes had tested a weakened version of bone and blood stripping on the shield. Cuthbert's barrier hadn't lasted 3 seconds before it shattered into points of light. Cuthbert glanced toward the other side of the room. Hermes sat cross-legged on the floor, an old book spread open before him, one finger tracing a complex diagram on the page. He felt the eyes on him and looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching. Want to try? He asked. Cuthbert shook his head. Let me practice more first. He knew the gap between himself and Hermes. He also knew the gap between Hermes and Regulus. That second gap was wide enough to make you question reality. Were they truly attending the same school, taking the same classes? Did the Black family carry some special bloodline power that let a first-year master magic that gave adult wizards headaches? Regulus wasn't paying attention to their conversation. He'd moved on to coaching Alex through protego. You have to want to block it, Regulus said. Reciting the incantation isn't enough. You need to actually feel the refusal to be harmed. Your magic follows your intent. Alex gripped his wand, closed his eyes, and furrowed his brow. He spoke the incantation. A flicker of silver light emerged from the tip, but the glow held for barely 2 seconds before dissolving. It never even took the shape of a barrier. I was thinking it. Alex opened his eyes, voice tinged with frustration. Make it more specific, Regulus continued. Imagine a curse actually flying at you. You have to protect yourself. Feel the urgency. Alex tried again. The silver light lasted 1 second longer this time, its edges expanding slightly before collapsing. Cuthbert watched from the side without comment. He knew his own experience learning protego hadn't been this difficult. His father had forced him through 5 days of practice, 8 hours a day, until his wrist swelled up. But by the 5th night, the barrier had taken shape. The process had been agonizing, but the result was clear. He could cast it. Alex's talent was weaker, or rather, something in his personality was getting in the way. He was too cautious, too quick to doubt himself. That whisper of "I probably can't do this" contaminated his magic like an impurity during casting, making the spell's structure brittle. But Alex listened to Regulus. When Regulus told him to keep practicing, he raised his wand again and again, repeated the incantation again and again, even when nothing changed. That kind of persistence was its own gift, though it was a gift of character, not spell work. It had nothing to do with protego specifically, but it might bloom with a different spell someday. Once they were all settled into their routines, Regulus crossed to the far side of the room. Time to work on his own. Progress on Space Warp had accelerated beyond expectation since he'd locked down the incantation. He raised his wand and aimed at a stone platform 5 meters away. No incantation needed. A thought, and magic surged through the wand. The air around the platform began to warp, the spatial structure shifting. Through his spatial perception, a half-meter radius centered on the platform buckled as though kneaded by invisible hands, grid lines bending, folding, unfolding. It happened in the span of a blink. The platform vanished and reappeared 20 meters away in the corner of the room. The placement was precise. Regulus walked over to inspect. Surface temperature was normal. No frictional heat, no residual magical energy of the kind spatial transfers usually left behind. That meant the warp had been smooth enough. The object hadn't been subjected to extra stress while passing through the spatial fold. He kept testing. 50 meters. This time the target was a thick book on a wooden table, to be sent to the top shelf of the weapon rack at the far end of the training room. Wand up, wand down. The book vanished from the table and appeared on the top shelf in the same instant, spine facing outward, standing upright and perfectly steady. 100 meters. This time, the table itself. The training room wasn't long enough. Regulus willed the room of requirement to expand, and the far wall slid back another 50 meters. The table vanished and materialized on the open ground 100 meters away, all four legs touching down at once. It didn't even wobble. The upper limit on object size had increased too. Something larger, like a human body, was theoretically possible. But Regulus hadn't attempted it. The risk of warping living matter was orders of magnitude greater than with inert objects. If the spatial fold fluctuated even slightly mid-transit, what arrived on the other side might be a pile of shredded meat. He stood in the center of the training room, staring at the distant table, and a new idea surfaced. Could space anchor charm be combined with space warp? Space warp had an obvious flaw right now, it could only transport objects with no active magical properties. He'd tried sending a spell through. A disarming charm, for instance. When the beam of light entered the spatial corridor generated by the warp, the spell's internal magical structure and the spatial fold interfered with each other. Two fundamentally different types of magic colliding. The result was the spell detonating midway through, scattering into a spray of meaningless magical debris. Regulus thought, what if, at the exact moment the warp corridor formed, he used space anchor charm to lock the spatial structure in that region? The essence of the space anchor charm was stabilization. It drove magical stakes into a selected area, pinning space in place, resisting external distortion and tearing. That stability was normally applied to static space. Preventing an enemy from operating away, for example, or shielding an area from spatial magic. But what if you drove the anchor into space that was actively changing? The corridor generated by space warp existed for a fraction of a second, maybe a tenth of one, and during that window the spatial structure was in a state of extreme instability. If an anchor was driven in at that precise moment, forcibly locking the corridor's shape, it might allow a spell to pass through safely. The theory held. Practice was another matter. Regulus spent 2 days on it. The first day was a total failure. He cast space warp first, then tried to layer the space anchor charm the instant the corridor formed. The two spells' magic clashed. The anchor had barely taken hold before the corridor collapsed, taking the warp with it. The object he'd been transporting got stuck halfway. One half in normal space, the other half lodged in a spatial gap. It took considerable effort to fish it back out. The second day he reversed the order. Preset the anchor, then activate the warp within its range. This time the corridor stabilized, but the anchor's stabilizing properties were too dominant, locking down the flexible folds the warp needed to function. The corridor opened, but nothing could pass through. The spatial structure had gone rigid as steel plate. Objects bounced off it on impact. The third day, he found the compromise. He manipulated both spells simultaneously, restricting the anchor's stabilizing effect to the corridor walls and leaving a flexible channel through the center. This required splitting his magic into 2 streams. One maintained the warp's fold generation. The other controlled the anchor's area of effect. And the 2 streams couldn't interfere with each other. On the 17th attempt, it finally worked. A disarming charm's red light passed through the corridor and struck the wooden dummy on the other side. But the result was poor. After traversing the corridor, the spell retained maybe a tenth of its original power. The red light had gone thin and pale, leaving only a faint mark on the dummy's chest. It didn't even kick up splinters. Magical analysis told him the spell had been diluted in transit. The anchor's stabilizing effect had protected the corridor but also filtered out most of the spell's magical energy. What arrived on the other side was little more than a warm glow, incapable of real damage. Still, compared to the spell simply detonating, this was progress. Regulus kept refining. He found the problem lay in anchor strength. Too strong, and the anchor stabilized the spell's magic along with the space, leaving nothing but meaningless light on the other end. Too weak, and the corridor couldn't hold. The spell blew apart midway. He needed a critical threshold. Just enough stability to hold the space without interfering with the magic passing through. That demanded extraordinarily precise control. In the instant of casting, Regulus had to gauge the corridor's stability threshold, then fine-tune the anchor's magical output in real time. A fraction too much wouldn't work. A fraction too little wouldn't either. By the fourth evening, he finally managed to send an impediment jinx through the corridor intact. The spell landed near the dummy's feet. But the cost was steep. He was mentally exhausted. Simultaneously controlling two advanced spatial spells while adjusting parameters in real time was a heavier burden than raw suppression of Fiend Fire. Suppressing Fiend Fire was a contest of force. You faced a raging, semi-sentient mass of energy and held it in place through sheer will. The whole thing was pulling and pushback, a constant wrestling match. That kind of fatigue was physical and magical. An arm wrestling match with an invisible opponent. Layering spatial magic was weaving. Two streams of magic, different in nature and almost adversarial, had to be twisted into one without cancelling each other out, working in tandem. It required playing two roles at once. His mind split into two independent processing regions. One calculated the fold curvature for the warp. The other monitored the anchor's stabilizing output. Both had to exchange data in real time, correcting deviations on the fly. That kind of fatigue lived in the mind. But the direction was right. Chapter 128, Huddling for Warmth. Space Warp plus Anchor. It worked. Spells could pass through spatial corridors. The limitations were obvious, only impediment jinxes and disarming charms so far, with power loss on the other side, and the caster left half dead from exertion. But the path was open. Nothing like this existed in known magic. Apparition transported the wizard themselves. Portkeys moved objects to fixed locations. No existing spell could send an attack curse from point A to point B without it traveling in a straight line between them. If Regulus could truly fuse these two spells into a stable method of warping curses through space, the combat advantage would be devastating. His disarming charm could bypass an opponent's protego and materialize behind them. A stunning spell could strike upward through the floor, hitting from a visual blind spot. He could even transport Fiend Fire inside an enemy's defensive perimeter and detonate it from within. But all of that was a long way off. The Space Anchor charm could sustain 3 simultaneous anchor points at most, each lasting 15 minutes. For real combat, he'd need at least 5, with double the duration. More advanced development, like giving the anchors selective stabilization, locking space without locking magic, remained beyond his reach. His mind drifted back to Professor McGonagall's lesson. She'd stretched her office space, flipped it, warped it. That kind of direct spatial manipulation operated a full dimension above his warp and anchor work. Could the three be combined? Space warp was point-to-point transfer. Space anchor was regional stabilization. Spatial transformation was structural reshaping. If all three could be unified, something far more complex might emerge. Folding a section of space into a pocket and trapping an enemy inside it. Flipping space like a mirror, reflecting every curse back at the caster. Tearing space open entirely, generating a brief black hole effect. The ideas spiraled through his mind. Regulus pushed them back down. Too far ahead. Each spell held enormous potential, but he hadn't even mastered the basics. Space warp could barely transport inert objects. The anchor was still in quantity training. Spatial transformation, he hadn't even set foot through the door. The level of control McGonagall demonstrated required at least a decade of transfiguration expertise. One step at a time. He walked back to the wooden table and raised his wand again. The thorn attack kept spreading, and nobody was containing it. Dumbledore's breakfast speech had suppressed the chatter briefly, but over the following week that pressurized atmosphere fermented into something else entirely. In Ravenclaw, Ileana Thorne had taken 3 days off. After returning, she rarely spoke, head down through every lesson. Professor Flitwick had moved her to the front row. The students around her kept their distance, whether from rejection, discomfort, or simply not knowing what to say. Hufflepuff maintained their usual stance. Sympathy, but no involvement. Gryffindor was different. They treated it as a declaration of war. The conflicts began. The target was clear, Slytherin. But Slytherin never took a beating lying down. They hit back in equal measure. Gryffindors preferred the direct approach. Spell volleys, fists, head-on confrontation. They relished the collision, as though courage could only prove itself through opposition. Slytherin's responses were subtler. No open standoffs. They chose their moments, but struck harder. By week's end, beds in the hospital wing were getting scarce. The irony was that the fighting stayed confined to the lower years. The upper years on both sides watched with the detached amusement of adults observing children roughhousing. Perhaps, in their view, this was nothing more than a dress rehearsal before the real war. Let the novices get a taste of the atmosphere. Tuesday night, Regulus returned from the room of requirement to the Slytherin common room close to 10 o'clock. Normally at this hour, the common room held only a handful of upper years by the fireplace reviewing for their O.W.L.S, or a couple tucked into a corner sofa whispering to each other. The younger students would have gone to bed already. 11-year-old bodies couldn't handle late nights. A full day of running wild, and by 9 their eyelids were losing the fight. Tonight was different. When Regulus pushed open the stone door, 2 first years were standing just inside. They looked like they'd been waiting for someone, or standing guard. Rigid posture, eyes darting. The moment they saw him, both dropped their gazes to their own shoes. Their breathing went deliberately quiet. Samuel Vance and Lena Costa. First-year half-bloods. Regulus glanced at them and walked straight past. Neither looked up. Only after his footsteps disappeared around the corner toward the dormitory corridor did he hear the faint sound of exhaled breath behind him. Back in the dormitory, a thought flickered. Do I look that unfriendly? It lasted half a second before he dismissed it. Friendly or not didn't matter. Distance did. He didn't need to have a relationship with every Slytherin. Too exhausting, and pointless. Relationship management was Alex's job. That was exactly how Regulus had positioned him. He reached his bed and hung up his outer robe. Cuthbert and Hermes came in one after the other, each heading for their own beds. A few minutes later, Alex pushed through the door. His expression was odd. Like he'd heard something unexpected. He walked to Regulus's bed and hesitated. Regulus looked up. Alex fumbled. So, spit it out. Regulus watched him. Cuthbert and Hermes glanced over, then turned back to their work. Cuthbert had a charms essay to write. Hermes had herbology. When they finished, they'd swap and copy. Alex took a breath. Samuel and Lena were waiting for me outside, he said, speaking fast. They said they've been getting cornered by Gryffindors all week. On the way to the greenhouses, in the library corridor, and yesterday evening by the Black Lake. He paused, watching Regulus's face. Regulus motioned for him to continue. They tried to fight back. Alex's voice dropped. Samuel landed a jelly-legs jinx on Macmillan, but there were 3 of them. Lena's impediment jinx didn't form before her wand got taken. After that, they got locked in the abandoned girls' bathroom. Stuck for nearly an hour before a Hufflepuff happened by and let them out. Cuthbert slapped his quill down on the parchment. Who? He turned around, brow furrowed. Which Gryffindors? Alphard Pruitt, Alex said. Plus Colin Macmillan and Gareth Diggory. The 3 of them always move together. Cuthbert's lip curled. The Pruitt family's youngest? I met his father last year. 2 drinks in and he wouldn't stop boasting about his son having Gryffindor courage. And this is what that courage looks like? Bullying first-year half-bloods. His tone dripped contempt. Cuthbert looked down on mixed bloods. He believed pure blood talent ran deeper, that the lineage was cleaner, that mixed blood was dilution and muggle birth was contamination. But none of that stopped him from believing Slytherin's people were Slytherins to deal with. Outsiders laying hands on them, especially Gryffindors, was a slap across the entire house's face. Alex waited for him to finish, then filled in the details. Alphard Pruitt was a troublemaker. The youngest son, 2 older brothers both in Gryffindor. He'd provoked Regulus during their first flying lesson, gotten put in his place, and hadn't come back for more. Now, it seemed, he'd redirected his attention toward easier targets. Colin Macmillan's family dealt in magical herbs and had ties to the Pruitts, so the 2 boys had grown up together. Gareth Diggory. The Diggory family had some connections in the Ministry of Magic, but they weren't core pure blood. A trio that exclusively targeted Slytherins caught alone. Within Slytherin's first-year class, the dynamics were delicate. Regulus and his 3 formed their own faction. Nobody dared touch them. A handful of other pure-blood students had clustered into a second group, eating together, attending classes together, a self-contained unit. That left Samuel Vance and Lena Costa. Both half-bloods. Samuel's father was an ordinary wizard running a small second-hand magical goods shop in Diagon Alley. His mother was a muggle, reportedly a primary school teacher. Lena's mother came from a minor Portuguese magical family without pure blood standing. Her father had died young, and she carried her mother's surname. By rights, that background shouldn't have gotten either of them into Slytherin. The house accepted half-bloods, but usually required some family pedigree or exceptional personal talent. Yet here they were. Which meant the Sorting Hat had seen something in them. Ambition, perhaps. Or maybe a certain ruthlessness, a willingness to do whatever survival demanded. Those qualities hadn't yet converted into strength at age 11. They couldn't cast advanced spells. Their magical control was average. In a house that valued bloodline and power, marginalization was inevitable. Nobody explicitly shut them out, but nobody let them in either. Group work always left 2 students over. Common room conversations never had room for their voices. So the 2 of them clung together. Like 2 small animals in winter, pressing close, surviving on each other's warmth. Regulus knew all this. He didn't normally pay attention, but information found its way to him regardless. He could intervene. A single sentence would change everything. All he had to do was publicly declare that these 2 were under his protection, and he was certain no one would touch them again. The quiet exclusion inside Slytherin would ease up too. But he didn't want to step in directly. Chapter 129, A Fight Bonus. Regulus's time belonged to more important things. Deepening his spatial magic and natural magical energy, refining fiend fire control, each demanded enormous reserves of focus. He still had to contend with whatever tentacles Voldemort's forces might extend in his direction. Sticking his neck out for 2 half-blood first years didn't make the priority list. If he charged in every time he witnessed an injustice, he'd never get anything else done. Mediating disputes alone would keep him busy until graduation. Besides, direct intervention would blur his positioning. He was Slytherin's first-year chief, the Black Heir, a prodigy under observation from multiple factions. The moment he publicly championed 2 half-bloods, certain people would read into it. The Black family softening on blood status. Or Regulus Black consolidating half-blood support. Both were things he could afford to do. Not yet. So he chose the indirect route and looked at Alex. Alex fit this role well. He was pure blood. The Rosier branch family was minor, but minor still meant pure blood. His temperament ran gentle, and he'd always gotten along with Samuel and Lena. By pure blood standards, gotten along meant being willing to speak to half-bloods at all. He had Regulus behind him, but the backing wouldn't show its face. That left room to maneuver. Regulus wanted Alex to learn how to handle situations like this. Not every conflict could require his personal involvement. He needed people around him who could operate independently, resolving small-scale problems as they arose without reporting every detail up the chain. This situation, Regulus asked him. Do you want to handle it? Alex froze. His mouth opened slightly. He blinked, as though the question hadn't registered. After a moment, he managed to stammer out, they only asked me to pass the message to you. It hadn't crossed his mind to handle it himself. Samuel and Lena had waited for him in the common room, pleading with him to relay their situation to Regulus, hoping the first-year chief might say something, or at least send Cuthbert to intimidate the Gryffindors. They hadn't expected anything from Alex. In the eyes of half-bloods, he was the approachable pure blood, someone you could talk to, but never someone who could solve problems. Now Regulus had tossed the problem back at him. Alex's thoughts tangled. Did he want to handle it? Maybe. A little. He'd walked past once while Samuel and Lena were being cornered. He hadn't stepped in. The discomfort had lingered afterward. But wanting to and being able to were different things. He'd struggle against 1 Pruitt, let alone 3. In a real confrontation, the odds of getting his teeth kicked in were high. Cuthbert stood up and crossed to Alex, stopping close enough that Alex could see the impatience in his eyes. What's there to hesitate about? Cuthbert's tone was sharp. Slytherin's getting bullied by Gryffindors, and we're supposed to swallow it. So what if they're half-bloods? They're Slytherin half-bloods. Whatever happens inside the house stays inside the house. Outsiders don't get to touch ours. He turned to Regulus. I'll go find Pruitt. Don't need 3 people. I'm enough. Regulus watched him, waiting for the heat to settle, before speaking. If you go, are you going as a Cuthbert, or as a Slytherin first year? Cuthbert's mouth snapped shut. The Avery family held positions in the Ministry of Magic. They were half-colleagues with the Pruitts. If he invoked the family name, the matter could escalate to a family-level dispute, and his father might get dragged in. If he went as an individual, then it was one first year picking a fight with 3. A win was fine. A loss was humiliating. Cuthbert ground his teeth. I can't let this slide. Which is why you need a strategy. Regulus's voice stayed level. He looked at Alex. The boy was still dazed, but something new had crept into his eyes. The tension of being shoved to the front. And beneath it, a flicker of responsibility he hadn't noticed in himself. Regulus knew Alex needed a push. You handle it. He rose and met Alex's eyes. Cuthbert backs you up. Don't just beat them down. Make sure they never try it again. Figure out the method yourself. Alex swallowed. He looked at Regulus, then at Cuthbert, and finally his gaze dropped to his own shoes. A beat passed. He lifted his head, voice still thin. I'll handle it. He turned to Cuthbert, quieter still. Will you help me? Cuthbert rolled his eyes. Obviously. What, you think I'd let you go get pummeled alone? Hermes walked over from his bed. He'd been silent the entire time, but he'd heard everything that mattered. He took a position on Alex's other side, though his eyes were on Regulus. 3 against 3 is fair. I'm going to. Regulus nodded. He understood what Hermes meant. This was the first joint action since he'd reintegrated into the group. The scale of the conflict was beneath him, but he'd chosen to stand with them regardless. One instruction. No dark magic. Hermes grunted acknowledgement. The roles were clear. Alex would lead. Cuthbert would hold the line. Hermes was the muscle. That combination could handle any conflict at the first-year level. Alex drew a deep breath and walked out of the dormitory. Through the door came the sound of hushed voices. Samuel and Lena had been waiting in the corridor. Regulus heard 2 sharp gasps of surprise, then Alex's voice explaining, growing steadier as he spoke. He shook his head and stopped paying attention. Time for the restricted section. A tap of his wand against his chest, and the outlines of his body began to blur, color draining away until he merged with his surroundings, invisible. He pushed the door open and left. In the corridor, Alex was still talking to Samuel and Lena. The 2 half-blood first years wore expressions caught between shock and hope. They saw the dormitory door open and close, but no one came through. Not even a faint breeze brushed past them. Regulus stayed in the library until 10 to 8, then closed his book and returned it to its designated spot on the shelf. The corridor torches had already been lit when he stepped out, casting orange halos that wavered across the stone floor. At 8 o'clock sharp, he pushed open the door to the room of requirement. The other 3 were already inside. Cuthbert was shadowboxing the air, mouth providing his own sound effects. Whoosh! Crack! Alex sat on a wooden crate nearby, rubbing his right leg, eyes bright. Hermes leaned against the wall with his arms folded, face blank. The sound of the door made all 3 turn. Cuthbert rushed over, feet moving so fast he nearly tripped. Regulus's gaze swept his face. The left eye socket was bruised dark purple, swollen until the lid was barely a slit. A split at the corner of his mouth had only just scabbed over. Cuthbert grinned, tugged the wound, and immediately sucked air through his teeth. We won. The excitement in his voice was uncontainable. Regulus's eyes shifted to Alex. He'd risen from the crate, wobbling when his right foot hit the ground, weight tilting left. Someone had gotten a solid kick into his shin. His expression carried that same charged energy. The timidity he usually wore like a shell had cracked open, something bright showing through underneath. Last, Hermes. He walked over with an even stride, face clean, robes unwrinkled. But Regulus noticed something off about his expression. Too calm. In his natural state, Hermes carried a faint layer of brooding. That was baseline. This deliberate composure was the opposite of what it appeared. It meant whatever was underneath wasn't calm at all. The outcome wasn't surprising. Cuthbert was the weakest of the 4, but among the first years, few could produce a complete protego. He was one of them. The bruises on his face were par for the course. Young wizards' fights always went this way, spells missed, magic ran low, and it devolved into fists. Taking a punch was normal. Winning was what counted. Hermes was another matter entirely. Outside of Regulus, he was the strongest in their year. Raised on dark magic and willing to hit hard, he could have taken on second or third years if the leash came off. Even restricted to standard spells as Regulus had ordered, 3 Gryffindors were well within his range. Against opponents of equal skill, his edge was temperamental. He'd commit to a brutal strike. The other side might hesitate. Alex was the mild surprise. The injuries said he'd taken his share of blows, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. So I can fight too. Normally, he had to be dragged into motion. Inert until pushed. But once someone gave him that push, he moved, and his follow-through was solid. In any case, a win was a win. Regulus walked up to Cuthbert and clapped a hand on his shoulder. Cuthbert's grin widened further, blood seeping fresh from the split lip, and he couldn't have cared less. He moved to Alex and did the same. Well done. Regulus gave him the extra words. Chapter 130, The Anonymous Letter That Wasn't. Alex's ears burned red at the tips. He ducked his head, then raised it again, eyes shining. Cuthbert bumped him with an elbow. Their gazes met, and something had shifted in Cuthbert's expression. A new equality in the recognition there. Regulus noted it with quiet satisfaction. Nothing bonded kids faster than a shared fight. The experience of conflict, especially the high of winning together, accomplished more than 100 pretty words ever could. He turned to Hermes. No shoulder clap. Just a nod. Hermes returned it with studied composure, but the corners of his mouth were pulled too tight, betraying the effort it took to hold his expression in place. Regulus reached into his robes and produced 2 small glass vials, tossing them in twin arcs toward Cuthbert and Alex. Both fumbled to catch them. Dittany essence, he said. Put it on yourselves. Cuthbert unscrewed the stopper and dabbed a drop of the clear salve near his eye. The cooling sensation made him sigh, eyelids fluttering half shut. Alex copied him, spreading the ointment over the bruise on his shin. It worked fast. The purple-red discoloration faded visibly beneath his skin. That was the end of it. Regulus didn't ask for a play-by-play, didn't ask who hit whom, didn't ask what threats were exchanged. Cuthbert opened his mouth to volunteer the story, but Regulus had already crossed to the wooden table at the center of the training room. Cuthbert shut his mouth and swallowed the words. Practice began. Maybe the night's adrenaline hadn't fully drained, because Alex's protego showed marked improvement. He raised his wand, closed his eyes, drew a slow breath. When they opened again, his gaze had sharpened. Protego. Silver light surged from the wand tip, spreading rapidly into a translucent barrier. The edges rippled, the shape not quite uniform, but this time it held. It lasted only 5 seconds before shattering into motes of light, yet compared to the formless attempts before, this was a leap. Cuthbert wanted to test the barrier's strength. He backed up 3 paces, leveled his wand. Impedimenta. Light struck the shield. It shuddered violently, spiderweb cracks racing across its surface, but it held. Didn't break. Not until Cuthbert fired a second impedimenta did the barrier finally collapse. Alex stood panting, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes burned brighter than before. He stared at his own wand like he was seeing it for the first time. Regulus watched from beside the table, a thought turning over in his mind. When emotions ran high, magic responded more directly. For young wizards especially. Their magical control was imprecise, their spell structures unstable, but strong emotion crystallized intent. That fierce desire to make something happen overrode the usual self-doubt, and magic flowed along the path of will, filling in the gaps that technique left behind. When Alex had cast the protego just now, his mind would have been locked on one thought: block it. That urgency had drowned out his habitual hesitation, and the spell had formed. Worth arranging more of these activities. Not necessarily fights. Competitions, challenges, simulated duels. Let the emotions kindle, let the magic rise to match, and practice in that state. The results might far surpass what came from reciting spells out of a textbook. Regulus pulled himself back to the present and started his own practice. Tonight was Fiend Fire. He drew an iron box from the table's drawer, prepared by the room of requirement to his specifications. Inside were small combustibles for practice. A few wood chips. A ball of cotton wadding. A tiny vial of rendered fat. He emptied them onto the tabletop. Then he raised his hand. The incantation structure for Fiend Fire had long since been burned into his consciousness. All he needed was the right emotional fuel. He recalled the despair of the grey mist on the astronomy tower. The crushing weight of Voldemort's presence. The consequences of failure. He let those dark emotions become kindling. His magic stirred, restless. Palm facing upward, fingers loosely curled, a point of orange-red flame ignited 3 inches above his fingertips, conjured from nothing. The flame was tiny, no larger than a fingernail. Its core burned white-hot, edges rimmed with gold. The heat was perfectly contained. Not even the fine hairs on his palm curled. Control. A shift of intent, and the flame began to reshape. It stretched from a sphere into a thin line. Seconds later, a matchstick-sized fire serpent hovered above his palm, body coiling, head raised, mimicking the flick of a forked tongue. It had no tongue to speak of, but the fiend fire captured the gesture all the same. The little serpent crawled between his fingers. From index to middle, sliding to ring finger, its tail sweeping through the gap at his pinky. The temperature stayed safely leashed. His skin registered warmth, nothing more. Nowhere near a burn. This kind of control required splitting his consciousness in two, one stream maintaining the fiend fire's shape, the other suppressing its instinct to devour. Fiend fire had life, but it wasn't truly alive. What it possessed was closer to an existential inclination hardwired into the magic itself. It wanted to burn. To spread. To turn everything it touched into fuel. What Regulus was doing now was yoking it with pure will, confining it to the boundaries he'd drawn. The serpent crawled to his wrist, then up along his forearm. He channeled more magic, tightening the fire's density. Its body solidified, color deepening from orange-red to a dark crimson. Where it passed, it left a brief trail of light on his skin, but not a singed hair, not a scorch mark. 30 seconds. The serpent destabilized. Sparks spat from its tail end, the first sign of slipping control. Regulus immediately reined in his magic. The serpent contracted, shrank back to the original flame, and winked out. He lowered his hand and exhaled. 5 seconds longer than last time. Slow progress, but progress all the same. Fiend fire's danger lay in its lack of middle ground. Either total mastery or total backlash. Those 5 extra seconds meant his understanding of the fire's nature had deepened by another fraction. His fiend fire was still absurdly small. It wouldn't match a single scale edge of one of Voldemort's fire serpents. But he felt no discouragement. Even Voldemort couldn't have suppressed fiend fire in his first year. He rested for 2 minutes, waiting for his magic to stabilize, then began a second attempt. This time he tried splitting. After the flame ignited, he guided it with intent, coaxing it to divide into 2. Both wisps of fire writhed, each trying to become its own small serpent, but the instant they separated, the control difficulty spiked exponentially. Like trying to pin down 2 frenzied cats at once. Hold the left and the right one claws you. One serpent took shape. The other detonated before it could fully form, spraying sparks onto the wood chips on the table. The sparks twisted immediately, already trying to morph into something with purpose. Regulus crushed it with will alone. Splitting demanded far finer magical allocation. And unlike the dual channel processing needed for combining space warp and the space anchor charm, where his brain divided into 2 independent calculation zones, this might require pairing with mental partition techniques. Next time. The following morning at breakfast, the daily flood of owls poured into the great hall. Grey and brown and white wings beat the air, feathers mingling with the morning light. Regulus was spreading blueberry jam on toast when an unfamiliar owl dove straight toward him. Its plumage was deep brown, with a ring of white markings around each eye. An uncommon breed. In its talons it clutched a rolled parchment. No envelope. The scroll was tied with twine, hastily done, bearing no seal or crest of any kind. The owl landed on the rim of his silver plate, claws scraping faintly against the metal. Regulus set down his butter knife. He swept the parchment with a pulse of magical awareness first. No trace of dark magic. No curse signatures. No tracking or alarm charms attached. An ordinary piece of parchment, rolled and tied. Only after confirming it was clean did he reach for it. The owl extended the scroll, and because Regulus was half a beat too slow in taking it, the bird pecked his hand in irritation. With his other hand, he plucked a strip of dried meat from the table and offered it over. The owl snatched it, tipped its head back to swallow, let out a satisfied coo, and launched itself back into the air. Regulus untied the twine and unrolled the parchment. The handwriting was unremarkable. No personal character to it at all. Every letter as uniform as typeset, the stroke width perfectly consistent throughout. Either the product of deliberate training or a charmed quill. The content was equally spare. A single line. Tonight, someone will make a public statement in the common room. The topic concerns the recent shift in sentiment. Recommend observing. No need to intervene. No signature. No closing. No specific time. But the meaning was pointed enough. Tonight, the Slytherin common room. Someone was making a move. The recent shift in sentiment. Vague phrasing, but in context it could only refer to what had been building since the Thorn family attack, that swelling undercurrent within the house, the whispered talk of cleaning out the unworthy. Regulus read it through, his expression unchanged. He rolled the parchment back up and tucked it into his robe's inner pocket. Cuthbert shot him a questioning look from the side. Regulus gave a slight shake of his head, and Cuthbert dropped his gaze at once, returning to the fried egg on his plate. Regulus let his eyes drift casually down the length of the Slytherin table. Lucretius Burke sat at the far end, speaking with a seventh-year girl beside him. He held a goblet of pumpkin juice, sipping occasionally, his gaze roaming the hall with the easy attentiveness of a prefect surveying his domain. When that gaze swept toward Regulus's end of the table, their eyes didn't meet directly. Lucretius was looking at the tapestry behind Regulus. Regulus was looking at the candelabra beside Lucretius. But in that instant, Regulus understood. The letter was from Lucretius.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.